Good morning, everyone. Oh, it's a room full of educators, recovering educators, almost educators, so you know how this works. Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us for NAEP Day 2022, whether you are here in the room with us at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., or you are joining us online. We welcome all of you. We are excited about this opportunity to be together again for the first time in 3 years. I am Dr. Tonya Matthews, President and CEO of the International African American Museum, being built in Charleston, South Carolina, scheduled to open this coming January. As of this month, I am a National Assessment Governing Board alumna. And I am excited to still be able to participate in this important sharing of information. The National Assessment Governing Board sets policy for the National Assessment of Education Progress, otherwise known as NAEP, more easily pronounced as the nation's report card. Today, we'll be joined by the National Center for Education Statistics and education researchers and leaders to talk about these highly anticipated results in mathematics and reading in grades 4 and 8. The nation's report card measures what our students know and can do. It is the most comprehensive data set of its kind in our country. It includes 53 states and jurisdictions, 26 urban district dives. NAEP is a vital tool to understanding how our students are learning. So we have a lot to discuss today. So we're going to take this in 4 parts. First, we will hear about the report in mathematics, a very short break, then a report in reading. Then we will take a 30-minute break and encourage everyone to return, because once we have the data, the question becomes, so what do we do now? And that is what the second half of our day will be. We will begin with remarks from the Council of Great City Schools and talking about our district level results. And then we will have an extraordinary panel of education experts and those on the front lines to give us their ideas and their insights as we are marching forward. There will be opportunities for the audience to ask questions during each of these sections, so we will give some direction when that time comes as well. Finally, we also invite those who are online to submit their questions as well, and we do hope that you are following us on all of our channels. In my 8 years as a member of the National Assessment Governing Board, I have served in various educational roles, some on the informal side in museums, science centers, now a history museum, also in university, and I'm also the daughter of an educator. So I bring to this not just a passion for education, but an unshakable belief in our students and their ability to learn anything and everything that is put in front of them with proper opportunity and motivation, and of course, belief from those of us who are supporting them. The governing board represents all such figures and minds and folks that play in this space. We have stakeholders all across education. We include state school chiefs, school board members, researchers, the business community, state legislators, governors, wild cards like myself, superintendents, principals, teachers, and parents. And one of the most powerful things about the National Assessment Governing Board is we all come from distinct perspectives with one distinct joined agenda, and that is educational progress for all of our students. After 2 years of an unprecedented disruption in learning, today, we take an opportunity to objectively look at what may have happened, what has happened, what the impact of the pandemic is, and begin to chart our way forward as we ask ourselves, what do these results show since 2019? How does this year's data add to our understanding about the work ahead? I ask everyone who is participating today to attempt to suspend confirmation, activate discernment, and remember that this has always been about educational progress. And just because we are stepping into an opportunity where we may have to take bigger, faster, wider steps, this is not a moment for paralyzing discouragement. This is a moment of extraordinary motivation. This is what and why we do. And with that, I will turn things over to Dr. Peggy Carr, the Commissioner of the National Center for Education Statistics, to walk us through mathematics. Dr. Carr.
Thank you, Tonya. It's always a pleasure to share a stage with you, especially now in your last moments with the board. Good morning, everyone. It is great to be here to share the results from the 2022 NAEP Math and Reading results. A lot has occurred since we last collected these data in 2019. And before I get into the findings, I think it might be fitting for me to acknowledge the context around the results that we're going to see today. As you all recall, on March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared an international pandemic. What followed changed the world and how many Americans went about their day-to-day lives. Businesses and schools around the country closed, and we began what is now known as the new normal. At the National Center for Education Statistics, we knew that there would be questions around best practices at this time and how it relates to academic achievement. To this end, I asked my team to survey schools and to help paint a picture of how the schools were adopted to this change. The monthly school survey, sometimes known as the MSS, was sent to schools around the country between January and May and asked several questions about their current practices, including learning mode in 2021. What we found was that while schools were beginning to open, 1 out of every 2 students were still learning in a remote environment at the end of the 2021 school year. But just a few months later, when the 2021-2022 school year began, well, we see that nearly all students, almost all of them, have access to in-person learning, and yes, they are taking advantage of it. This is a tremendous effort on behalf of our schools and the school staff all across this country. A separate data collection from NCES called the School Pulse Panel also surveyed schools and asked questions about the impact of the pandemic on education. One question found that the overwhelming majority of teachers were concerned about their students' ability to meet the academic standards set forth by their schools, by their districts, and their states. Understanding that the academic outcomes aren't solely related to what is happening in schools, the School Pulse Panel also asked additional questions that would help us better understand the whole child, and this is important. One of those findings that stood out to me personally was that 70% of public schools noted that the percent of students who sought mental health services increased since the start of the pandemic. So this isn't just about the academics. Our first look to see how the pandemic may have impacted academic achievement was about 2 months ago when we released the long-term trend data on 9-year-olds. You recall that. It was sobering. In the 50-year history of the assessment, the results show that we had the first ever drop in mathematics and one of the largest drops ever in reading. Additional student and school questions pointed to inequities between higher and lower performing students, suggesting that even within remote learning, their experience was not the same across all groups. Additional insight into the learning environment of 4th and 8th graders will only be enhanced by the results I'm getting ready to share with you today. So now that we have covered the context, let me begin with sharing just some highlights. There's lots of data. I'm just going to focus on the highlights. And first, I'm going to focus on the mathematics results. And after the break, we'll turn to the reading findings. As a reminder, these data were collected earlier this year between January and March, where we assessed over hundreds of thousands of kids, nearly 500,000 kids in the 4th and 8th grade in over 10,000 schools. That's a lot. We will report scores in a couple of different ways. Scale scores, which indicate what students know and can do. And we will also look at scores as bifurcated by percentiles, so we can look at the entire distribution, how students of all abilities are doing. And we will look at scores as they relate to the achievement levels set by the National Assessment Governing Board, basic, proficient, and advanced. They indicate what students should know and be able to do. And as I mentioned earlier, we also had contextual data from students, from schools, from teachers, and that will enhance our understanding of these findings and the educational environment where these students were learning. So let's get started. Here we see the trend charts for grade 4 mathematics at the top and grade 8 mathematics at the bottom. The asterisks indicate a particular score, whether it is statistically significant from the 2022 number. The 5-point decline at grade 4 and the 8-point decline at grade 8 are the largest declines we have ever recorded for this national assessment. To get a better understanding of how achievement looks across the distribution, as I indicated earlier, we're going to look now at the percentiles, specifically those at the 10th and the 25th percentiles. I'll refer to them as lower performers. Those at the 75th and the 90th percentiles, I'll refer to them as the higher performers. And then, of course, we have those at the 50th percentile. They're sort of in the middle. So beginning with 4th grade on the left, we see declines across the percentiles. However, lower performers decline at a faster rate. So that 6 and 7 that you see there is statistically different from the top of the distribution at 2 and 3. So that means the lower performers were declining at a faster rate. For grade 8 mathematics, and that's shown here on the right, we see uniform declines across all percentiles, with lower and higher performers declining at the same rate. So everyone's going down and at the same rate. Those are different patterns. Here you see the NAEP achievement levels as I described earlier. They indicate what students should know and be able to do relative to the scale. And again, they're set by our National Assessment Governing Board. In grade 4 at the top in 2022, 25%, a quarter of the students, are below NAEP basic. That means they did not meet the minimum standard set by the National Assessment Governing Board. This is an increase from the 19% that we saw in 2019. On the other end of this chart, you see that 29% of the students are at the NAEP proficiency level, solid mastery over academic, challenging subject matter. This is a decrease from the 32% in 2019 and consistent with the drops we have been discussing. At grade 8, that would be on the bottom of this chart, you see a similar pattern with students below NAEP Basic growing, not what you want to happen, and students at the NAEP Proficient declining, also what you don't want to happen. In fact, almost 4 out of 10 students are now not reaching, I should say, the NAEP basic level. And again, that basic level demonstrates partial mastery over fundamental skills needed to be proficient. More students in the below basic range. To better understand what students know and can do, well, we thought that it might be helpful to share with you one of the items that we're going to be releasing. Actually, it's today. We've already released it. This item is from the 8th grade assessment and from the algebra subscale. Students were asked to create an equation based on the relationship described in the question. I'll give you a second or two to ponder this. What they were asked to do was to drag the correct expression into each box. Here you see in the next slide the correct answer. In 2022, 41% of students answered this question correctly. It is a lower percentage than the 45% of 8th graders who answered it correctly in 2019. Gives you a sense of what it means to decline in this assessment. Let's now look at performance by race ethnicity, beginning with grade 4. Here you see that the 2019 score, well, it's in light blue, and the 2022 score is in dark blue. If the differences are statistically significant, they will be indicated by a large down arrow. Here you see that both Black and Hispanic students showed 7-point declines, 6-point drops by American Indian, Alaskan Native students, 5-point drops by students of 2 or more races, 3-point drops by white students, and 4-point drops by Asian students. Almost all of these students, except for one, showed significant declines. In grade 8, you see a similar story. Black, Hispanic, and Asian students all showing 7-point declines. White students showed an 8-point decline, while students of 2 or more races showed a 10-point decline. No widening of the gaps here, but I should have mentioned on the previous slide that there were some widening of the gaps between Black and brown students and their white counterparts for 4th grade. Other notable student groups are shown here in this slide for 4th graders. You see on here on the right, for 4th graders on the left, my right, and grade 8 on the right. Males, females, those eligible for free and reduced price lunch program, and public school students show drops at both grades. You can also see that English language learners declined at grade 4 but held steady at grade 8, while students in the Catholic schools held steady for grade 4, but they suffered a 6-point decline in grade 8. mostly declines here. Now I'm going to move to the states and district results. First, here's a summary of the state changes. At the top, you see that 43 states declined in grade 4 math, with 10 states holding steady, holding their own, and no state showing an increase. At the bottom, for grade 8, you see that 51 states showed a decrease. 2 states showed no change, they held their own, and no state showed an increase. Pretty dramatic. To see how the magnitude of the state changes vary, we compare the state score declines here on this map. This is for public schools only. This is a map of the United States. There's a lot going on here, so I'm going to hold it steady here for a little bit and talk you through it so we are interpreting this in the same way. The gray color shows that states, they had no decline compared to the 2019. You see those are 10 states, if you count them there, by region, left to right: Hawaii, Nebraska, Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, and the Department of Defense. In white, you see the states where their score decline was similar to the national public score decline. And there are 2 of them, Wyoming and South Dakota. Now we're going to go to the light blue. This shows states where their decline is no different from the national decline. Well, there are a lot of them. There are 33, so I won't bother to read them out. To understand the magnitude, let's see. We are on slide, I can't read that. Okay, finally the full picture. That's where we are. These states in the darkest blue are where the declines are larger than the national public decline. And you can see there are 8 states here: Oregon, New Mexico, Minnesota, New York, Maryland, D.C., Delaware, and Virginia. And so that's the 4th grade, and so now we have the whole picture. We're going to now turn to 8th grade. And the slides read the same way, but we won't step through them in that fashion. Here you see in gray 2 jurisdictions, Utah and the Department of Defense schools. They're being the only jurisdictions to hold steady in grade 8 mathematics. I'll say it again, Utah and the Department of Defense. 4 states in white show decreases smaller than the national public decline: Alaska, Idaho, Nevada, Rhode Island. 44 states in light blue show changes comparable to the nation. And 3 states show drops that outpace the nation: Oklahoma, West Virginia, and Delaware. Now we see the summary for our district results. We're going to turn to them next. We're going to begin with grade 4 at the top. Of the 26 TUDAs, TUDA, Trial Urban District Assessment, that's our term of endearment, 23 showed declines in grade 4 math, and 3 districts showed no change. In grade 8, 22 TUDAs, or districts, showed declines, and 4 showed no change. To understand the magnitude of the change in the districts, we compare their changes to changes of our large cities. A large city, as defined by NAEP, is any city with at least 250,000 people. In order to be considered for participation in TUDA, the Trial Urban District Assessment, you must be a large city and at least half of the students must be Black or Hispanic, or half must be eligible for the free or reduced price lunch lunch program. So let's begin with grade 4, where large cities had an 8-point decline. 3 districts, Austin, Dallas, Hillsborough County, had no significant change and are colored here in gray. Los Angeles is colored white because their change is smaller than the large city change. The 19 districts colored light blue had declines not different from the large city. And there are 3 dark blue districts: Cleveland, Baltimore County, Charlotte-Mecklenburg, and they all had declines larger than the large city decline. For grade 8, the large city decline was also 8 points. We see that there are 4 districts that had no change as indicated in the gray. That means they were holding their own throughout all of this disruption. LA, New York City, Philadelphia, and Miami-Dade. 21 districts colored light blue had changes comparable to the large city change. And Shelby County in dark blue had a decline larger than the large city decline. So this concludes the math portion of the release, and I'll turn it back over to Dr. Matthews, and we can take a few questions. We'll sit together and see what we can do to respond to our questions today.
All right. Thank you, Peggy, as always, for walking us through the data, a lot of data in ways that we can see and understand and take chunks. And I encourage folks to begin thinking through questions now that they might like to ask. We're going to have microphone runners in the room, and then we're going to have access to questions that come in online. And I do emphasize the word question when we get to that part. But I've got a few questions that came to us beforehand, so we're going to kick off and give folks some time. So in your presentation, we saw score changes among several different student groups. Can you talk to us a little bit about if those changes in a particular group contributed to achievement gaps or had effects on the gaps narrowing or widening?
Yeah, I said a little bit during my presentation, but it's worth exploring a little bit more. The 4th grade mathematics, we saw declines that were greater. They were greater for Black and brown kids, Black and Hispanic kids, in comparison to their white counterparts, which means that the gap is larger. They were already large, and now they're larger as a result of this disruption. But there are more gap widenings. Gender gaps. I was quite honestly surprised to see that females were declining at a faster rate than their male counterparts. So there's a widening of gaps there. And then, of course, the point I was making earlier about, students at the 10th and 25th percentile declining at a faster rate. What that means is that there's a widening of the gap between the higher performers, who, by the way, are also declining in math, and the lower performers. So that is getting wider. Yes.
Thank you. That struck me too in terms of watching some of those gaps. I think really taking home the point that proficiency and mastery makes a difference.
Yes.
It does make our students more resilient. The more command they have of a subject when their education is disrupted. So, grade 8. Grade 8 seemed to take the brunt of the impact. You showed that we have sort of the largest, consecutive assessment declines ever in math. What else makes these declines historic or unique other than, say, just the numbers themselves?
Well, I want to first point out Utah and the Department of Defense because they held steady. And, one can think about this as sort of a bright spot, maybe even resilience, given all that was going on. So I want to first point that out, that Utah and the Department of Defense held steady. In 2019, we were reporting scores for our struggling students at the 10th and the 25th percentile as declining. And we were concerned because it wasn't the first year that we noticed that they were declining. These are our struggling students. And what we're now seeing is that they're declining at a faster rate. Well, that's sobering. But what we're now seeing is that students who were at the top of the distribution in 2019, the higher performing students who were doing better, they were flourishing in the pre-pandemic age, now they're also declining. So it's everyone's problem. It's not just those lower performers that we need to focus on. It's systemic, Tonya.
Thank you for that. I think that is a really good sort of assessment of, I think, the way we need to think about things for those of us who have never really appreciated anything that was status quo. My background's always progress and moving forward. I think this is a good moment to motivate us.
Yes.
Because it's clear.
It's time for a reset.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right, so we are ready to begin to surface some questions from the audience. If folks want to sort of raise their hands, we'll have a mic brought to you. And as the mic does get to you, I ask for folks to just give your name and your affiliation as that comes through. So I'm gonna look, I'm doing a couple of things. Sure, we've got one up here in the front.
Thank you. Lincoln Snyder, National Catholic Educational Association. Was there anything in the data to suggest a correlation between date of return to in-person instruction and the rate of decline?
Really good question. Everyone wants to know the answer to that question. Let me first say that the declines, particularly in math, were comprehensive, widespread. They were everywhere, with the exception of a few bright spots, which we'll talk about when we get to reading. All jurisdictions and the districts declined, except for those two cases that we talked about before. They held steady. So it was a comprehensive pattern that we're seeing. There's nothing in this data that allows us to draw a straight line from remote learning in and of itself to student performance. It's complicated. There are no measurable differences in performance between districts and states who stayed in remote learning longer than others because of this widespread pattern that we're seeing. And then guess what? Things were not as good as one might think in school. It wasn't normal there either. So there were a lot of things going on. We're going to take a look at it when we get time to do more digging with more advanced analysis. There's probably something there, but it's not in these descriptive data that we're talking about here. But no, there's no straight line like people want to draw.
Thank you. All right. Our next question. Oh, thank you.
Oh,
Over
there's
on
lots
this
of questions
side,
over
that
here.
seems to be
Yeah.
the side of the room right
Yeah.
over there.
Hi, Charlotte McCloskey from the National Center on Education and the Economy. I'm wondering what you want schools, districts, and policymakers to take away from these results. What do you see as the actions coming out of these data? And first, thank you so much for your presentation as well.
Well, Tonya and I, we can both address that. What do you think, Tonya?
So I think one of the things is, even to the previous answer you gave, that there's not going to be a single solution. We've been talking about individualized tools. We've been talking about the need to understand the difference between classrooms and districts and students. And so I think particularly when you're thinking about the workforce, we also want to think about that. The second thing I want us to think about is, while we're really focused on what happened between this assessment and the last assessment, if we go farther back, say to 1990, as the data show, we can see that we're still above where we were in 1990, and that may give us a more specific question. Okay, what did we learn to do over the last 10 years that we weren't able to do right now? Right, as we think about prioritizing those things. And I would say last but not least, these hints that we're getting around the truth about monitoring the whole child, if not the whole educator, as we have normalized the need to understand mental health, not just in terms of being healthy, but what that does to your ability to learn and master new information in the classroom while you're dealing with other things.
I'll underscore that because we have been taking a look at the schools every month, the Pulse survey that I shared earlier, and mental health issues really are a concern not just for the student, but for the teachers as well. There are just so many other factors that are being disrupted. So we really do have to look at the whole child. But I want to add something else to what Tonya has shared. We need evidence-based strategies with science behind them, ones that have been proven to work. And guess what? They're not all created equal. All of these strategies don't work equally as well with all students, and so we've got to match them. The best practices with students that can benefit most from them. And all of this means is that we have to have more time on task for these students. Whether we're talking about double-dose tutoring, high-dose tutoring, whatever it is that you call it, extended day, more time during the day, summer, all of the above needs to take place. And we can't do it alone. All of the policymakers from the local schools to the state, to the federal, we all need to be shoulder to shoulder making this happen. And the public as well, businesses, faith-based organizations, community. We need to all be on task to pull this off. And we don't have any time to waste. We need to start now.
Thank you for that. All right, do you have a question right here as well?
Hold on, I have a question from
sure.
online. Scott McLean, a teacher, asks, and this is, I think, kind of getting to where we were talking before, I witnessed a loss of self-control in many students, especially with regard to use of digital devices. Were you able to ask questions about the use of digital devices and academic achievement?
We were certainly able to ask questions in this assessment and in the other ones that I described. Here's a finding that I recall that sticks in my head. During the course of the pandemic, we really did a good job in this nation getting devices in the hands of students. We did a good job in getting internet access to students, but there were still inequities. There were still opportunity gaps. And when we asked students about, did you have a device? They say yes, but did it work? Was it what was the quality of it? Lower performing students gave some cause for concern as opposed to their higher performing counterparts. So we've done well. We've, made a step forward, but there's still inequities when it comes to these devices and the quality of the internet and having access to a strong technology.
Yeah, and I would build on that. This is a rather extreme analogy, but it was in sometimes equivalent to if the public transportation system all of a sudden went completely down and the solution was to hand everyone a car. Okay, regardless of whether or not you knew how to drive. But we'd all been in vehicles. We kind of understood the rules of the road. There is something semi-intuitive about driving, a car, as long as it's not a stick shift. But that was sometimes what we were seeing. What other data has shown is that being a quote unquote digital native is not the same thing as being digitally literate, right? Being able to use these tools in a very, very effective way. And of course, many of our schools and educators were also making bold experiments and using new platforms, using the technology in different ways and having different interfaces. And with all of that going on, what we have learned is that going forward, some of these may work, some of these may not work, but we have learned that the onboarding, the training around how to use the tool and time to become familiar with these new platforms has become essential. As recent as 2.5 days ago, I was muted for the first half of my sentence on Zoom. I don't know if anyone is also having those experiences, but I think that's actually what we learned in terms of that.
And what about the teachers, Tonya? The teachers struggle to get themselves prepared to conduct these types of learning experience and instructions with their kids. I mean, we've done a lot of work, I think, getting students and teachers alike prepared and ready to conduct these types of learning experiences, but that was also a learning experience for teachers.
Yeah, and I think as someone who's a big fan of technology, if we think about what usually does not have to happen in those kinds of sessions, usually you're not giving presentations and teaching and running your technology at the same time. Right? Even as we got better at it, I'm sure a lot of you participated in presentations, and they were the tech folks, and then there was whoever was doing the presentation. In the classroom, it's a little bit different, right? Because teachers are used to having full control of the entire environment. And so we went into that digital space. We mimicked that identically. A teacher having full control of the entire environment. But it's a little bit different, right? Managing, I think, the technology along with managing your learning curve for the technology, managing your students' learning curve for the technology. And by the way, they're still students, and now they're closer to the refrigerator. So we've got all of these different kinds of things that were happening. And so I think one of the fundamental learnings of that is the fundamental question we're now asking. How do we support educator use of technology in the classroom? Again, no silver bullet, no answer, but I think that is the fundamental question. How do we support in that space?
Absolutely.
All right.
We have a question
Over here.
here.
Hi, good morning. Jennifer Bell Elwanger, Data Quality Campaign, and thank you both for this presentation. Just wondering, as we're thinking about states working to communicate these results with their schools and in their school community, what resources or how can they share these results and make them actionable for their teachers and for their families?
Well, my guess is that we can both respond to that. You know, I mentioned earlier that we need to have shoulder-to-shoulder partnerships. You know, one entity can't do this. Not federal, not state, not just the local. We all need to be working together to figure out how to communicate best practices to the practitioners. You know, in my conversation with people just in the past few months, it is clear to me that all disciplines, many disciplines that may not think they have a role in getting us over this hump, they do. So communication specialists, for example, I know I'm not a specialist in communication, but there are those that are. And how do you communicate in plain language to stakeholders? Yes, sorry, I got a little involved there. How do you communicate what they need to know? So all the disciplines have a role here.
And for that, I'd like to offer a compliment, a follow-up question, which is that NCES has incredible data sets beyond even what we're talking about today. And of course, as the nation's data collector, you ask questions on a very macro level, a very big level. Are there any questions that we ask through NAEP or through other educational assessments that you do that you think would also work on the micro level, that school districts or educators or school systems themselves could be asking? If there were sort of key questions that you would want folks to be asking and communicating, these are the questions we're looking at right now, what would they be?
Well, we're asking questions about strategies. I mentioned the type of strategies that we've seen some evidence-based science behind double-dose tutoring,
Define that for some folks.
Oh, yeah. Tutor and then tutor again. High-dose tutoring, more time on task with small, interactions with a professional that really knows how to do it. We were having a conversation with some researchers, again, just the other day, and they were concerned about implementing these types of strategies with fidelity, quality. So you can't just give lip service to high-dose tutoring or double-dose tutoring. You got to know what you're doing. So the training needs to be there. So what works clearinghouse? I'm advertising that for IES to go there. They've done a lot of work on strategies that work. We have a lot of information at IES that we can share, I think, with the public. But we need our comms people to help us get it across.
Yes, an extra shout out to everyone who is in a communication profession or has that role for communication. I think it is one of the things we really learned, that communication really, really is key. But the good news is that right now folks are actually looking for information. Right?
They are.
And so folks are going to be specifically paying attention. And so this is a really good time to step into that space with, as you said, high fidelity.
Yes.
All right, we've got time for just a couple more questions. I'm looking across.
I have a question from, online. Another question from online. Emerson Elliott of Cape asks, would you agree that one thing the data demonstrate is that schools make a difference? When students lose access to them, their performance declines. Mr. Peggy.
If I had to rank order the messages that we want people to go away with, that's one of the ones at the top. It's not the top, but it's certainly one of the ones at the top. School matters. Schooling matters. We all knew that math was very sensitive to instruction. Well, these data underscore that. We need schools. If we can't do it by ourselves, we need teachers. We need the whole package. And that is so, so important. One of the takeaways from this whole impact. I think these results represent a defining moment in education for the whole country. And we're going to remember this. And one of the things I hope we take away is that schooling matters and that we need to support our schools and the whole system, the teachers, the districts, the whole package.
And I would say that in the broadest and authentic definition of school, for me, it's well-structured, well-tailored, reliable learning environments matter. I think when we say disruption, we kind of forget it's not just that you went home and then you did nothing. You had a different environment. It wasn't necessarily as structured. Folks around you were doing their best, but perhaps were not trained educators, trained moms and dads and aunts and uncles, but not necessarily trained educators. My family is a hybrid family. Half the children are classically, as we would say, educated like myself, and then half are homeschooled, and we're all doing very well. But literally every woman for the last 3 generations in my family has been a trained educator. So we managed to have those rigorous and structured environments. And I think it's the structure that we lost. Not just the structure for the students, but the structures of support for our educators as well, through no one's fault. It was a very different environment. And so I think that the take-home message is that well-structured, well-supported learning environments are really, really key
Yes.
as we move forward.
Good question, Emerson.
Thank you. There's a lot of light in this section, so it's really hard for me to see over here.
I see there's a hand over
Right back
here.
there.
Hi, I'm Jen Krajewski from Proven Tutoring.
Oh, Proven Tutoring. That's
Hi,
good.
I'm Jen Krajewski from Proven Tutoring at Johns Hopkins University.
Oh.
And, you know, I'm curious, what do you want families to take away from this data? And how would you envision them collaborating with their schools to increase achievement?
I think for me, one of the things that I encourage families to remember is how hard it was to be a classroom teacher. And to understand that there's a lot that goes into that space. And so collaboration, I love that word, that I think that is the key. And also, students are different. No one knows your child better than you do, perhaps the child themselves, but also, and that is the key role that you can play. With your child's teacher, right? And really helping them to understand that. And while we are not going to be in the driver's seat of our students' classrooms, many of us, again, I think it does give us insight in how we can be better partners when our teachers are giving us options. We can do this, or we can do this, or we can do that. We have a little bit more information that we can bring to that conversation. And I also appreciate where you are from, which is also now understanding that things like tutoring, mental health support, good, standard, basic, everybody sort of benefits. And these are conversations that may have had a stigma before or may not have been well received by parents when they were offered. And so I think that those are the kinds of things that I'm also hoping come out of this period.
So true. Should parents be worried? Yes, they should be worried. And I hope they get that message. But I hope they get the message that they need to turn that worry into action. Because this isn't going to go away on its own. It's not going to, we can just look away and then eventually it'll get better. It's not. You know, we have a whole generation of students whose academic careers were knocked off track, off course. And so parents need to know this is a serious issue here. It's not to be taken lightly. And they need to work with their schools and their teachers to help their students. And it's not good just to go back to normal, because normal wasn't good for some of us, was it? So we have to make pace, and we have to double pace for some students. That is what I hope parents take away from this. It's serious.
Looking for other questions. While folks are coming up with their last question, I want to take a slightly deeper dive into something I really appreciated that we did, the pulse surveys.
Oh, yes.
So the pulse surveys, for those who aren't as familiar, were quicker check-ins that happened a bit more frequently to catch a beat every several months or so inside of the pandemic. And we also got a chance to answer different kinds of questions. From your perspective, because NCES brings in a whole lot of data all of the time, did you find that tool useful enough to consider something like this as we move forward, even when we're not in, say, crisis mode?
Well, we're hoping that Congress hears us, because we're asking them to support us in this way, so thanks for the platform. The pulse is administered actually monthly, and we use it to, right now, it's focused on recovery from the pandemic, what's going on in schools with students, with teachers, with the schools themselves. And I'm just appalled at some of the things that I'm learning that I didn't realize that we could pick up and that we're still emerging as a result of this pandemic. So it's not over yet. You know, it's been declared it's over, but the impact of it is certainly not over. So we're going to continue with the Pulse survey. Hopefully, for the rest of the year, we're going to be looking at strategies that work, which teachers tell us, which those with boots on the ground tell us what is working. More if there are disruptions still going on, we're going to be looking at that. There's still some quarantining going on as well. You wouldn't be thinking that that is the case, but it is, so we're going to be looking at that as well. And then what about safety? I mean, that's another area, you know, with those shootings, remember that? That's sort of faded away for some people, so we're going to be looking at safety in schools. So there are lots of topics, timely topics, that you don't necessarily need to pull up a whole data collection, thousands of people, you know, to go out and collect these data when you can take a pulse of a couple of indicators at a time. So yes, I'm hoping that it continues. It's a wonderful instrument, and I think it is timely and responsive to our needs of today.
Thank you for that. We've got a question online and
Yes.
one coming through. Sure.
So this question is actually, I believe, asked on the school pulse survey, so I'll ask it here. This is from Richard Innes. Has there been any consideration of the potential for continued COVID-based absence issues possibly impacting the 2022 results? I know you.
Yeah, we looked at that. We looked at it hard. In fact, what we were doing at the beginning of the data collection was tracking it weekly, because we were concerned that there was going to be some problems with absenteeism, with students not showing up, with parents not letting, if I'm answering the question correctly, parents not letting students take the assessment. But we weren't finding anything that was statistically different than what we saw in 2019. A little numerically lower, but not statistically so. So, no, we're not concerned that there is a representation problem for these data at all. You know, there were a couple of districts that had just gotten back in school when we came in. So, you know, I have to admit that we were right there on the cusp of the pandemic winding down when we were in the school. We had a little problem getting into Japan. You know, they made us wait until quarantine was over. So a couple of hiccups, but nothing to speak of.
Thank you for that. I think we've got a question up here in the front, gentleman. Blue.
Hi. Hi, Alan Richard from the Southern Education Foundation in Atlanta. Good to see you, Dr. Carr. I just wondered if you might comment any further on, well, I'm biased, but the southern states and how they did sort of as a group, and if many of them had sort of different trends or slightly different trends than the rest of the country. And I also wondered if you'd say just a little bit more about the overall achievement levels and trends for Black students, for Latinx students, and also for students from low-income families or eligible for a school lunch program.
I'm going to ask you to hold that last question until we get to reading, because I got some really interesting things to share with the reading, but we don't want to give that away just yet. And I'm not remembering the southern region.
We held steady. I'm now in South Carolina,
Lord.
so I was paying attention. So yeah, so we were in the group that, you know, we had declines on par with the average of the rest of the nation, that we stayed in that space. And I think that one of the things that fascinated me by that as well is that we are also one of the regions that often has higher rural communities and populations and students. And I know we've really thought about that, particularly when it comes to access, when we are moving online in those spaces. So that's what I sort of remember, I think, from that.
Yeah, there may be more of a story in reading. I'll take a look at that when we come back. But what I want everyone to remember about math, it was systemic, it was comprehensive, it was double digits galore, everywhere. I don't remember the South, admittedly, but there are no positive stories around the math data, particularly 8th grade, where we saw all of the students declining at a higher rate. And I'm particularly concerned about math because it is the gateway to more advanced, this is your area, Tonya, more advanced course taking. So I don't know what happened with the South. We'll take a look at that. But let me say, there can't be any good in what we're looking at for math for anyone, because it is a story that is the same, relatively speaking, for all of the country.
We're about to, thank you for that, Peggy, and we're about to sort of break so we can go into the cliffhanger of reading that Dr. Carr has given us. But I would say that if there was one small glimmer of good news, is that we are experiencing a moment where everyone can learn from everyone. That there is something very interesting about being in this space, whether or not we are looking at our colleagues, states, and communities that are on par, perhaps those who are managed to hold, like what did you hold on to, and even those who did not perform as well as we did, who are going to be making perhaps some bolder choices and being able to watch. And so I think that if we can turn this moment of sort of across the board challenges in these declines and turn it into a moment of community and the ability to test solutions in multiple areas faster will be our superpower as we move through the next few years.
Yeah.
Okay, and with this, we're going to take a very, very brief break. It is just around 11:05 or so a.m., and we're going to come back at 11:15 a.m., and we're going to look at the second half of the results, focusing on reading. Thank you. Okay, welcome back. Welcome to part 2 of the release and presentation of the NAEP Day 2022. We're going to open up this next section with greetings and remarks from the board chair of the National Assessment of Governing Board, Beverly Perdue.
Thank you, Tonya. Peggy, thank you for the presentation on math. I hope you all are as alarmed as I am by the results. It's systemic, it's across the country. The data is clear. Reading will exacerbate what I hope are your feelings of urgency as we look at the work of our children and the work of schools all over the country. There is no understating the urgency that must be felt by every policymaker, every political leader, every mom and dad, every teacher, and just go down the list. This is big stuff for America, and equal to all of those players in what happens next is the business community of America. We are talking about a really serious erosion of children's capacities to read and count in the next generation of the workforce. And so this becomes a global economic issue for America. For the first time, everybody has a role in this solution, and everybody has skin in the game. And I urge you not to segment and not to pull and not to politicize. This is America we're talking about. Peggy, your leadership has been phenomenal on the whole issue. And we thank you for being our spokesperson today. Secretary Cardona and I talked on Friday about the results and about the comments that he was going to make. We are hand in glove on moving forward for the country. Whatever it takes across America, things have got to change. Focus has got to be paid on outcomes and on data. We're going to work with the data. So with that, Peggy, please come up, Dr. Carr, and talk to us about the next round of news.
Thank you, Governor Perdue. I'm going to share the reading results, but I want to first say a little bit about the question that came up regarding math to sort of round that out regarding the South and how the South is done. I pointed out that math was demonstrative, it was broad, it was deep, it was double digits in many other places across the country. We did take a look at the region. As it turns out, the South as a whole is right there at the average for grade 4, -5. And for 8th grade, they're again right there at the average for grade 8 at 8 points down. Now, there are a few states that are holding steady, and that is to be commended under the circumstances, but this is so widespread, there's not a lot of good news for math at all. So, having said that, now we're going to turn to reading. And if I didn't say so, welcome back. I hope we have repeat attenders today to listen to the reading results. So we're going to go right to the results. So here again, we have a national trend with grade 4 on top and grade 8 on the bottom. And the first thing you notice is that it is not as steep as math. But there's a lot under the hood, so don't get too excited just yet. So it's 3 points down for grade 4, 3 points down for grade 8. And the way this is working out, the average score is exactly what it was in 1992 when we collected these data. I was surprised by that. I had them double check it. It is correct. So what we're going to do now is to go through and take a look at what's under the hood for these data. We're going to start with the percentiles. We see a similar picture to what I described for math. On the left, you'll see a grade 4 reading. And you can see it's flat for the very tippy top, the 90th percentile. But you can see everything else is down. And notice that you have a 5 and a 6 point decline for the 10th and the 25th. That means greater declines for our most struggling students. So it's the same pattern. Even though that top of the distribution is holding steady, the bottom dropping means that the distribution is widening the gap between the higher performers and the lower performers. You need to keep that in mind. So when we look at 8th grade, we again see a similar pattern to what we saw for math. The declines are across the board and they're comparable. It's not like the bottom is declining faster than the top. Those things are not, we tested them, they're not statistically different. So that's the picture for the entire distribution. Now, we're going to go to the achievement levels. And remember, achievement levels indicate what students should know and be able to do, whereas the scale scores indicate what students actually know and are able to do. And here we see that there has been a shift in the distribution even for that 3-point decline, whereby there are more students, then that asterisk means the same. That means it's statistically different from the 2022 number. So we now have more students in the below basic range than we had before. And we have less students in that proficient range than we had before. And that's for grade 4 and grade 8. So 3 points is translating to more students in the area where we don't want them to be. That is what you need to take away from these results. Now, as with math, I want to highlight an item we are releasing or have released today, and it will help us understand the skills and knowledge of students. This is what we call a scenario-based task, and we love them. We have released it today, and the scenario-based task provides students with a special purpose for reading, and it guides the students through a linear path of questions within the context of whatever it is they are being asked to read about. For this particular one, it's about oceans of plastic. Is a 30-minute task with 8 questions that present the student with the situation that they are members of a class and they are studying the problem of plastic garbage in the world's oceans. That is the scenario. The students are told that they are going to have to work as a team with their classmates. You can see their classmates shown here. And their charge is to select information from the website to educate other students in their schools. And there are 2 particular areas I wanted to point out. Why the plastic in the ocean garbage patch is a problem. How people can help solve the problem of ocean garbage patches. Those are that's their assignment. Those are the questions. Students began by reading a full-length article about plastic garbage in oceans, as you can see here. You can see how nice and inviting the materials are. And then they're asked questions about what they read. So the first question asked students about the main idea of the passage. 83% of 8th grade students were able to determine the main idea of the article from supporting, and they had to have supporting materials, including in their response from what they were able to take from the article. Now, 83%, you might say that's not bad, but is less than what it was in 2019. In 2019, it was 86%. We don't want to go backwards. As we continue now with the results, we began with performance by race ethnicity scores, and we're going to begin with 4th grade. Again, down arrows indicate that the differences between 2019 and 2022 is statistically significant. For grade 4 students, we see score declines range from 3 points for white students to 7 points for American Indian, Alaskan Native students. Black and Hispanic students had a 5 and 4 point drop, respectively. For grade 8, we'll see that only white students showed a decline, 4 points compared to 2019. All other race ethnicity groups showed no change. In fact, white students declined across their entire distribution. I had them to go back and look at it. From the 10th through the 90th percentile, they were all statistically down. While for the other race ethnicities that were flat, their percentiles were flat from the 10th through the 90th percentile. These data are representing something systemic that's happening with these groups, because the different parts of the distribution are not masking the overall trend that we're seeing. That's what you need to take away. Other notable group differences are shown here. You see some consistent declines with a couple of bright spots, and I'm going to put that in air quotes in the circumstances that this is bright enough. Male, females, those eligible for free and reduced price lunch program and public school students show declines in both grade 4 here on the left and grade 8 on the right. Students with a disability and Catholic school students showed no change in reading at both grades 4 and 8. While English learners showed no change at grade 4, an increase of 4 points was noted for grade 8 reading. That's interesting. It's one of the only improvements in this entire sea of comparisons that we've been doing that have shown a significant improvement. Now let's turn to the states and the districts. Our summaries show a lot of declines, but not quite as many as in mathematics. I hinted to that. At the top, you see grade 4 had 30 states show a decrease, with 22 holding steady. At grade 8, 33 states or jurisdictions showed a decline, and 18 no change, and 1 jurisdiction improved compared to 2019 in grade 8 reading. To understand the magnitude of change, we see our color-coded map again, the one that I showed you before, and I won't take you through how to read it. First, you see there are 22 states in gray. We know now what gray means. It shows no statistically significant change in grade 4 reading. In the light blue, we see the 22 states whose change is comparable to the national public score change of 3 points. And there's that dark blue, those 8 states whose declines were larger than the national public score: Oregon, Idaho, Oklahoma, West Virginia, D.C., Delaware, Virginia, and Maine. For grade 8, 18 states had no change as indicated by the gray shown here. 27 states had changes comparable to the national public change, and 6 states had declines larger than the national public decline. They include Oregon, Kansas, Oklahoma, West Virginia, Delaware, and Maine. And the Department of Defense schools was the only jurisdiction, I guess you were trying to figure out who's that jurisdiction. They're the only jurisdiction here to actually show an improvement compared to 2019. Now we're going to turn to TUDAs, our Trial Urban District Assessment participants. We have a similar story here with the declines, not quite as prevalent and pervasive, but declines nonetheless in comparison to mathematics. In grade 4, 9 TUDAs had a decline where 17 held steady. In grade 8, at the bottom of this chart, 4 TUDAs showed a decline in 21, holding steady, and 1 TUDA showed an increase in grade 8 reading. I'm going to talk to you about that in just a moment. Here you see a lot of gray, showing the 17 districts that show no change from 2019. 5 districts in blue had declines comparable to the large city decline of 3 points. Shelby County, that's in Tennessee, Detroit, Michigan, Duval County, that's in Florida, Guilford County is in North Carolina, and Baltimore City, right here in Maryland. Or almost right here in Maryland. and 4 TUDAs had declines larger than the large city decline. Clark County, that's in Nevada, Cleveland, Ohio, Atlanta, Georgia, Charlotte, Mecklenburg, that's in North Carolina. Finally, grade 8 reading has 21 TUDAs holding steady, as you can see here in the gray. The large city variable was also flat compared to 2019. In light blue, you see Jefferson County, and that's in Kentucky, had a decline that was comparable to the no change for large cities. The 3 TUDAs had declines that were greater than the no change for the large city. They included Shelby County in Tennessee, Cleveland, Ohio, and Guilford County in North Carolina. 1 TUDA, Los Angeles, showed an increase in grade 8 reading comparable to 2019, the only TUDA to show an increase of 9 points was LA. So to end the presentation, I want to share some data from our questionnaires. We kept talking about questions that we'd given to students and to teachers and to schools. So I want to give you a little bit of a highlight there. And I want to share with you this particular question. Let's go to the next question. Yes, next slide here. The first question was asked of the 73% of students who indicated that they learned remotely in 2021. So 73% of the students says, yes, I learned remotely. And so we took them aside and we asked them questions, but first we bifurcated them into those scoring at the 25th percentile or lower, and that's shown here on the left, and the higher performers on the right, those who score at the 75th percentile or higher. So we asked these students whether you had access to a teacher, remember we talked about this earlier, to help them at least once or twice a week. 60% of the lower performers indicated they did have access compared to 77% of higher performers. Now, not bad, pretty good, but there is an opportunity gap here that we don't like to see. We also asked if they participated in real-time video lessons with their teachers every day or almost every day, asynchronous instruction. Again, lower performers were less likely to have access to this very important resource as compared to the higher performers, their counterparts there. 41% versus 71%. This is not what we would like to see. Finally, we asked teachers, remember we have a teacher questionnaire, we asked them if they felt they had too many teaching hours. We always ask this question, this isn't a new question. But we ask now, we ask them so that we can compare them to 2019. 2019, do you have too many teaching hours compared to 2022? What we found suggested that teachers may be feeling overworked, more so than they were feeling before. If you look to the far right, almost 1 out of 10 teachers indicated too many teaching hours as a serious problem compared to the 6% in 2019. Statistically significant, that's what that asterisk means. On the other hand, about half of the teachers say this isn't a problem, down from 57% in 2019. Taken together, teachers are feeling a little overwhelmed, a little overworked, is what you should take away from here. So this was a lot of data, so what I thought I would do to end this is to summarize all of the findings so we can compare and contrast. So first, I'm going to show you the slide for all of the 4 grade subject combinations. And you can see here the largest drops for grade 4 and 8 were in mathematics. That's on the left side. But we still see that that's higher than the initial year in 1990. 3-point drops in grade 4 and 8, the same drop was noted. On the left, brought down to where the 2022 was brought down to where we measured in 1992 for both grades. So comparable, sort of flat over the time period. So now I'm going to go under the hood and tell you, just in summary format, very quick, for each one of these, what the highlights look like. Grade 4 math, we saw a 5-point decline, recall. Larger declines for lower performing students than higher performers. Larger declines for Black and Hispanic students than their white counterparts. Larger declines for females as compared to males. No score change for Catholic school students. Score declines for 43 states/jurisdiction and 23 districts out of 26. Massive. In grade 8 mathematics, we saw an 8-point decline. Consistent score declines across the percentiles. Remember, I talked a lot about that. Consistent declines for white, Black, Hispanic, and Asian students. No score change for English learners. Score declines for 51 states/jurisdictions and 22 of the 26 districts. Massive. Grade 4 reading saw a 3-point decline. Larger declines for lower performing students than higher performing students. Although, again, remember I talked to you about that 90th percentile that did not change. Declines for white, Black, Hispanic, and American Indian, Alaska Native students. No score change for students with disabilities or Catholic school students. Score declines for most states, 30, and fewer districts, 9. In grade 8 reading, we saw a 3-point decline nationally. Consistent score declines across the percentiles. Score decline for white students. No score change for Black and Hispanic students. No score change for students with disabilities. Score gain for English language learners. No score change for Catholic school students. Score declines for most states, 33, and fewer districts, 4. And again, score gains for LA. There are many more data available on the nationreportcard.gov than what I was able to share today, although I enjoyed all of it. I encourage you to go there and poke around and have fun with these data and explore our useful tools. They're very user-friendly in the nation's report card. But I would be remiss if I did not, in closing, thank the teachers, the schools, and especially the students who participated in this 2022 data collection. And I also want to thank our field staff and contractors who went into the schools and collected data during the height of the pandemic. Thank you again for attending today, and I also want to thank Tonya for her services. As I'm going off script now. But Tonya, it's been 8 wonderful years. You served us well. Thank you for your service. Once a NAEP, always a NAEP. So we'll see you later. Thank you.
All right. Thank you again, Dr. Carr. That was a presentation well-deserved of the cliffhanger that you gave us, and very nuanced in the presentation, because there is a consistent urgency, but not consistently delivered in the different sections. And so we're going to get to dig into that. Again, I'm going to start with some preliminary questions that we received beforehand, and then open up the floor and online for questions. And we did a wonderful job during our first session emphasizing the question when folks get the microphone, and it allowed us to get in a lot more thoughts. So the first, let's take a long view and sort of ramp up the sense of urgency. When you got to the summary slides, and it was also in your beginning slide, if we're looking at sort of the entirety of reading scores back to 1992, we seem to be where we were 30 years ago. We had some time where when we were trending upwards, and then, with the recent loss in performance, it's as if we have not changed over the 30 years. What are your thoughts around that?
Oh, I wish I had some very, very profound thoughts around that, but I don't. We're going to have to talk to the reading experts about this. I can look at the data and I can see some technical interpretations of what's going on. There are about 3 patterns. If you look at the decades are going on over this trend line. At some points early in the trend line, you'll see that the bottom is going down, the top is going up. Then there is a time period whereby they're kind of both doing okay. And still gaps from the top and the bottom, but trailing in the right direction. Then things fall by the wayside in the last few years, where there's this bottom dropping faster than the top. And of course, we know what the bigger story is. So I don't have a really good answer. I wish I did. Reading is hard to move, and we see that in our international programs as well. What I'm getting at with regard to the patterns across the time period, I suspect that some of what is happening is that this diverging trend line that we've been talking about more recently really was happening even earlier than we thought. And so there's a lot of wiggling going on underneath the hood with reading at the top and the bottom. But, I think the best answer is going to come from a reading specialist about what is happening with reading.
Thank you. I'm picking up a lot from your response there in terms of not just asking, okay, so what is happening now? And then we have to ask, how long has that been happening? Because sometimes these are questions that we're just realizing we need to ask. Now, there were a couple of bright spots. Caveat, bright in context. There were some interesting bright spots that jumped out in reading, and we did not see this in math. Have we had the opportunity to look into what happened, say, in Los Angeles or in the Department of Defense schools, where we did see some gains in at least one of the categories?
Well, let's talk about some other bright spots before we get to the LA and the Department of Defense. Because I was hinting at it, and I'm hoping people caught it, that there's something of interest going on with 8th grade reading, period. Because the cities did not decline. They held steady. And this is interesting because there has been improvement for the cities for a long time, because the cities have been closing the gap between themselves and the nation for several decades now. I'm hoping that Ray is going to say a little bit about that when he gets up here. So holding steady for the cities in the midst of this huge disruption that we've had to almost every part of our lives is something to think about. How cities were able to do that, I'm not sure. but it is something that I think we need to unpack and understand. The other sort of interesting finding that might be seen as resiliency is that white students decline in 8th grade reading. I want to say it was 4 points. And black and brown students didn't. Why is that? I don't know. Black and brown students don't usually fare better than their white counterparts, but something perhaps positive was going on. And we need to talk to those who have boots on the ground to figure out what that is so that we can have some lessons learned and emulate it. So those are the two bright spots I want to first talk about. Now, Department of Defense schools. Well, you know, I was telling someone just the other day, there was a 60-minute show on the Department of Defense schools a few years back because they've always done well. And they're a very diverse population. They're doing something right and have always done something right. So quite honestly, I wasn't surprised. I was happy that they continued to buck the trend, but they actually improved by 2 points. LA is another really good story, and I'm hoping the superintendent who's going to be on the panel later today it can talk more about that. I really would not like to step in his toes and take that on. Is Alberto here? Is he here? Yes. Would you like to say so? Oh, there he is right there in front of me. Would you like to say something now, or you want to hold to the panel? But this is the brightest spot that I see in this data.
Good morning. I'll tee up something now, but then of course I'll speak more during the panel. I share the recognition that across the board, 4th, 8th grade math reading, there's a problem across the country and as a nation. As our chair declared, and as you've said, there's a lot of work to be done, but first we need to recognize where we are. There's no way of ignoring the crisis condition. And most disheartening is the fact that the kids who were in crisis prior to the pandemic are in a deeper crisis today, with some exceptions, and you're absolutely right. It is interesting that the large cities did not fall as much as the nation. In fact, in some instances, they held steady, particularly in reading. That deserves to be studied. And I think in terms of outliers, in an otherwise dark universe of performance, there is a bright star in the East and there is a bright star in the West. So I was in Miami just 8 months ago. Miami held steady across the board, maintaining its high level of performance in TUDA. Los Angeles distinguishes itself not in terms of overall performance, but growth. So acceleration. In fact, out of the 4 areas tested, with the exception of 4th grade math, where its decline was half the decline of the large cities and 1 point below the decline of the nation, the other areas actually increased by 2 points in 4th grade reading, 2 points in 8th grade mathematics. But the true story, as you suggested, is as far as 8th grade reading, with a massive 9-point increase. That's a 12-point change compared to the large cities in the nation. Why? Well, I'll give you some reasons, and perhaps some of the reasons that may also explain the performance of large cities. Urban America probably pivoted during the pandemic towards more effective levels of connectivity, engagement, and attendance because of additional work that had been done prior to the pandemic in terms of one-to-one empowerment. So I think certainly I look back to my days in Miami-Dade and Los Angeles. We pivoted towards a more effective virtual setting because of investments made up front in terms of device empowerment, higher levels of connectivity rates, and higher levels of attendance. Secondly, and this is data specific to Los Angeles, something very interesting. When you look at elementary, middle, and senior, the most engaged students with higher levels of attendance during the pandemic and levels of engagement were actually middle school students. Interesting research possibility, because we all know, those of us who are educators, what happens in middle school. But during the pandemic, they actually demonstrated higher levels of engagement and attendance. That could be part of the explanation. The other one in Los Angeles, same in Miami, but particularly Los Angeles, higher level of standards aligned curriculum, massive amount of professional development entering the pandemic, during the pandemic, and exiting the pandemic, additional time on task, high dosage tutoring services in a targeted way that addressed the highest needs students to begin with. And that is why, as I close, you actually see a significant bump in performance with African American students in Los Angeles, with students with disabilities in Los Angeles, while the white students in Los Angeles, as opposed to the nation, did not lose ground. They too made improvements. So it's a combination of factors, but I think higher levels of attendance, quickly pivoting effectively to a virtual environment, faster than the rest of the country, professional development, investments in social and emotional support for students, reading coaches, math coaches, interventionists. I think it's a combined effect. It's not just a single factor.
Thank you for that. And I think the Superintendent Carvalho's answer, I think, underlines some of the themes that we're trying to get through, which is, one, we must know where we are. We simply must know where we are to move forward. Knowing where we are has to do with both knowing where we've been and then figuring out where we want to go. So context is key, and there's no silver bullet. You're going to have 4 or 5 of your fingers going at once, and it's the combined effect of those things as we continue to dig into what the data shows us, what the pulse surveys show us as well. All right, and so with that, the floor is now well opened, and I see a hand already up in the back there. Please give us your name and your affiliation as you give us your question.
Yes, hello, I'm Erin Bailey from Reading is Fundamental right here in DC. Thank you, Dr. Carr, for presenting that data. In the math section, you spoke about double dose tutoring. So my first part of my question is double dose tutoring as effective for reading as it is for math? And then the second part is we also saw data that teachers feel they have too many hours that they're working. So who is going to administer the double dose tutoring? Mm-hmm. And what credentials do they need to have? Do they need to be certified teachers, or can anyone do tutoring? Do they need to use interventions based on What Works Clearinghouse? So any recommendations you have are much appreciated. Thank you.
My half smile is because I'm not the person to answer those questions. I can take an educated guess, but my tutoring expert that we now know is right over here. Somebody needs to hand her the mic. My guess is that tutoring works probably more effectively with math than with reading. And I only say that because reading needs to be reinforced outside, definitely outside of the classroom. Reading for fun, any reading that you do outside of the classroom really is going to help. So if you're just tutoring, that's not going to be, my guess, is enough. But math is harder. And I mentioned earlier that math seems to be more sensitive to schooling, so that would be my guess. But it is a guess, and I think we're going to need our expert to come up, to stand up and tell us. You asked a lot of other questions. I don't feel as though I'm the person to answer them, but they are all good questions, and perhaps others in the audience. I see someone here who wants to take a stab.
I think he has a question.
He wants to ask another question. What about you, Tonya?
So as we go into that question, I would say that the word that I would pull out from your previous comments is also high fidelity. I think that underestimating the power of training, even when it comes to becoming a reading specialist and helping students with their literacy, may be something that we often underestimate. Oh, we'll just read a book with a child. That is part and fundamental to it, but when it comes to teaching the skills of reading, that too is a skill set, particularly when you're talking about double dosing and moving forward. You may end up with a kid like me who tricked teachers for a long time because my memory surpassed my reading skills. skills. And I could memorize a book even before I was sort of picking up all of the words and the nuances. My mother has great stories about this. And so to your point, I do think a question to be asking is, okay, when we're doing this double dose tutoring, what kind of training do our tutors need? What levels of specialists do our students need to support them in that work as well? A question right here, right behind you with the mic.
Hi, my name's Samuel Rowe with Data Quality Campaign. I have a question about how the tests are administered and like how the transition we see with respect to more students having devices and digital tools as part of like the recovery and the pandemic in general, how that may have, what are your thoughts on how that may have impacted students' results on the exam?
Thank you for your question, and it is a good one. We transitioned to digitally based assessment in 2017. We did some piloting, some work with it to make sure we knew how to do it in 2015, but we pushed everything over in reading and math in 2017. We take the devices into the schools. So we have standardized administration through the devices. Surface Pros is what we use. And we administer the assessment with well-trained administrators that are using materials and how scripts that they work with and how they present the information to the students. So we're not using devices in the schools, although we're hoping to go that way. We are hoping to have partnerships with the schools so we can have device agnostic administration of the assessments using Chromebooks. Yeah, Chromebooks is where we're going. So we're very confident, and this is something we do very well, is to standardize our administration of the assessment with the students.
Thank you for that. Additional questions? I don't want to ignore a particular side of the room. Please, over here, where's our mic runner? She's right behind you.
Can I ask a question first because it's a little bit about that?
Online?
On the online, is about accommodations. This is from Ashley Smith of the Virginia PTA. I think your last question kind of got at this. Does NAEP allow for accommodations to be given to students with disabilities?
Yes. We're also very good at that as well. In fact, in the mid-90s or so, we made an effort in collaboration with the National Assessment Governing Board to up the ante and provide greater access to the assessment by increasing the number and type of accommodations. And we match as closely as possible, if we can do it, with what the state does for their state assessment, so we can get as many students into the assessment as possible. We've also moved to what many of you know of as a universal design. Some things you need to be doing anyway that will enhance students' access to the assessment. So we do both. And this is again something that we've been doing for a while. We feel very comfortable with it, and we track it very, very closely.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Jing Hong Tsai from the National School Boards Association. My question is, the opportunity gap has been existing between students in the rural areas and the non-rural areas. And I wonder whether you see the data to show the opportunity gap affects rural students' achievement.
I don't know that off the top of my head. I have to look at the data to see what the opportunity gap is for rural students. But you know, the rural students are not lost on us. I'll just take an opportunity to advertise that we're getting ready to release a rural report in which we've looked at all the data that we've collected across the National Center for Education Statistics on various indicators and put in one hub so that people can take the due just look at rural education in America. But I have to get back to you on what the opportunity gap is in these data.
Dr. Carr, currently, what are some of the questions or the factors that we get at when we're looking at opportunity gaps? So you had the great slide that showed daily lessons, face-to-face lessons with students. We saw a very large gap for some of our populations there. What other sort of questions or factors do we look at when measuring opportunity gaps?
Who's doing the teaching? How good are they? How prepared are they? Are they certified? We have found, for example, that teachers who are certified in mathematics seem to have students who score higher than teachers who are not certified in mathematics and teaching it. So qualifications of the instructor, how long they've been teaching, the longevity seems to make a difference. There's an opportunity gap there. Students in high poverty areas, minority students are less likely to have those kinds of teachers, in abundance in their schools. So that's an opportunity gap. I mean, I can go on. Resources, we are concerned and we're tracking better than we have ever before. Opportunity gaps associated with local funding. State funding is, everybody gets whatever the state funding is, but not for local. Some parents, some communities are really, really into providing their schools with whatever it is they need, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that opportunity gap exists. Everyone can't do that. But there are a lot of opportunity gaps. We measure them in NAEP, but we have other surveys that we collect this data for as well. NTPS, the National Teacher and Principal Survey, that's where we collect a lot of this information, and we look at it by school, the characteristics of the school, where the school is, lots of variables, even the rural nature of the school. So yes, there's a plentiful of indicators that one can examine around the opportunity gap.
Thank you for that. And I think that's additional information as we talk about not necessarily a single factor. What we also provide is perhaps indicators to look at particular opportunity gaps. Once you know where you are, then seeing what perhaps there are some differences in opportunities that your teachers and educators have in their community that you may want to pull the lever on as we move forward. Right here.
David Griffith with the National Association of Elementary School Principals. More than 1 million Americans have died of COVID in the last 2.5 years, twice as many as killed in action in World War II in half the time. Have you asked, or might you ask, or look into how many students have lost a family member over this time, which is the preeminent trauma any child would face?
We don't have that data, but we have asked, and we are partnering with CDC. One of the studies that we're going to conduct later in the year is information that we're going to get from CDC about where the virus was and throughout the time period where we have these data and what was happening with the schools and what kind of impact that might have had on the scores that we're looking at. We have precisely 4,000 schools that we have information on that we collected. This was in 2021 about what was happening in their schools, and we're going to get the CDC data as well, and we're going to match those 4,000 schools, grade 4 and grade 8, with performance, and we're going to take a deep dive, a look at those data. So we'll see.
Thank you for that question. And it's one of the things that I'm also very excited about in taking on this urgency and using it as opportunity. So we're now asking questions around what is the trauma associated with students who are losing loved ones, and how does that interfere with their learning? We don't quite ask those questions yet at this scale for urban violence, for school violence. And so our ability to now dig into this data in that way may have implications for serving students, I think, in that space. Also, as we master hybrid learning and those kinds of opportunities when we're working with students who do need time away from the classroom for whatever reason, our ability to continue to serve them as opposed to simply allowing them to not return to school for 2 weeks for those reasons. So if we really take advantage of the urgency of now, of figuring this out right now, I think there are broader implications for having a much better, well-resourced, well-prepared school system across the board. Here we've got.
So Lincoln Snyder, NCEA. I had a question about internal migration in the United States and how it may have affected the data. In particular, in our urban areas, we saw significant changes, in many cases, decreases in school enrollment and or new students coming into the system. Has there been study of how that internal migration and changes in population may have affected the data?
I know you're not a plant, but you could be. We have seen a decline in enrollment, and particularly for the earlier grades, and we are concerned about what we are seeing with the white students. So remember, I told you 8th grade reading, so we went back and we looked at enrollment declines for 8th grade during that time, and they were higher for white students than they were for the other racial ethnic groups. So it's a hypothesis, but it's something that we're going to look into. Nothing final. It's something that we think may help us understand. That's an odd finding that we're seeing there. Where did those students go? Did they go to private schools? Did they go to schooling situations? Did they go to virtual schools? And we're not picking them up. We don't know. But we are looking into, and it's not just that particular finding. There are other concerns that we have about decline in enrollment. Over 1 million students didn't show up for 2-year colleges during this time, community colleges. Where did they go? That's the gateway to 4-year degrees and colleges. It's the gateway to community technology, types of careers, career and technical, I should say, careers. Where did these students go? So we've been talking about K-12 because that's our platform for today. But remember, the pandemic affected everybody up and down the line, including post-secondary. So yes, we're looking into it.
Thank you for that, Peggy. And as we now wind up this last session, I want to thank everyone for such the insightful questions and the probing that we're going to do in this space. And I think one of the things that we can say is that, there are some bright spots, but there are no safe spaces in this space. And I think that that's also part of where we find this urgency, but there is a lot of data and a lot of space to be courageous and bold, I think, in the things that we're doing. And I think that as we continue to look at these solutions and consider them solutions of the time, not solutions of the moment, we have the opportunity to move our approaches forward. I think one of the things that having something like NAEP, which has decades and decades and decades worth of data, is that we can understand one of our favorite words, which is trend. And that if we're actually trying to push things forward and progress, we're not looking for temporary solutions. We're looking for transformational changes within our system. And to start with that, we need to know where we are, and we are proud to be a significant source of that data. As we come back from our break, we will get to hear from some folks who are on the front lines, to get their insight, to get their thoughts, things that have worked, things that are about to work, what they're trying. We're also going to get to have some in-depth conversation with data from our urban school districts that we've seen may actually be holding some of the keys to what the nation needs to do. So we will see everyone back in 30 minutes at 12:45. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. If you are just joining for our afternoon session, also welcome again to all of those who are rejoining us, those who have chosen to stay in the room, and those who are listening to the sound of my voice live streaming as they drive back to their office spaces. I am Dr. Tonya Matthews, President and CEO of the International African American Museum and very recent alumna from the National Assessment Governing Board. As we began our NAEP Day 2022, we learned a lot about our nation's educational progress in mathematics and reading for our nation, for our states, for our jurisdictions across grades 4 and 8. There was a lot to digest there, and I encourage everyone to continue to explore the data on the nation's report card at our website, as well as the website for NCES, where you can dig into the data and see the charts and diagrams that were presented this morning in our official report on the nation's report card. One of the things that I think piqued much of our interest was the discussion of our large school districts and how they were doing, and the progress that was being made, the strategies that were being attempted, and what we were seeing there, which was as nuanced as any of our individual students themselves are. So with that, I only do the easy questions. So I'm going to invite to open this part of our afternoon, Dr. Ray Hart, Executive Director of the Council of Great City Schools, to share his thoughts and insights in this morning's report.
Dr. Matthews, thank you for that kind introduction. As she said, good afternoon all. I am Ray Hart. I'm the Executive Director of the Council of Great City Schools. And thank you so much for your interest in these important results. Before I begin, I want to thank Leslie Muldoon and her team at the National Assessment Governing Board, and Peggy Carr and her staff at the National Center for Educational Statistics for their insight. We appreciate your dedication and your expertise. Thank you. As Dr. Carr shared earlier, and as these charts represent, the 2022 Nation's Report Card for the Trial Urban District Assessment, or TUDA program, those results show that most participating districts held steady in 4th and 8th grade reading, as you see here. And they held in, in 4th grade reading scores, 65% of the participating districts remain unchanged from 2019, as compared to 42% of states and territories taking the assessment. Similarly, 85% of TUDA districts held steady or improved their scores in 8th grade reading from 2019 to 2022, compared to 37% of states and territories, with Los Angeles singularly, as you see here, significantly improving from 2019 to 2022. In addition, scores for large city schools remain unchanged in 8th grade reading, while public schools nationwide saw a decline. In mathematics, most participating urban school districts saw significant declines, mirroring the pattern seen nationally in the wake of the global pandemic. In general, large city schools lost ground to the nation in only one of 4 subject grade combinations. That was 4th grade mathematics, while 2 of 4 areas, 4th grade reading and 8th grade math, showed performance that mirrored the nation, and 8th grade reading held steady over this period. However, this is not a story about where we are as a result of the global pandemic. This is a story about where we're going. How are we investing in the future? How are we going to climb out of the student achievement valley that we find ourselves in after the challenges of school closures, staff and student quarantines, limited access to high-quality health care and broadband. The pandemic took a heavy toll on our schools, our communities, but the reading results from our TUDA districts indicate that the investments and the support from teachers, staff, parents, and the community are bearing fruit. The council and its member districts have been working to address the unfinished learning that the pandemic caused over the last 3 years. In June of 2021, the council released a guide on investing American Rescue Plan funds strategically and effectively. Every week, the council hosts virtual meetings for superintendents, school board members, chief academic officers, bilingual directors, special education directors, and others to strategize on how to accelerate learning, and we've done so throughout the pandemic. Additionally, the council released a handbook on how to keep students on grade level while addressing unfinished learning. The council disseminated tips for how to modify district curriculum, provide professional development, and monitor student progress as students resumed in-person learning. Our great city school districts have developed a portfolio of strategies to mitigate the impact of the pandemic that the pandemic has had on student achievement, including intensive grade-level classroom instruction, high-dosage tutoring, targeted summer school programming, and other extended learning time opportunities to address unfinished learning and provide mental health supports. Superintendent Carvalho, in the last session, addressed in detail the work that's going on in Los Angeles Unified School District, both before and after the pandemic, at the peak of the pandemic, to maintain and improve student achievement. Other examples include the Dallas Independent School District, which is using federal elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds, also known as ESSER funds, to create reading academies designed to implement professional development on the science of reading for kindergartners to third graders, for teachers and administrators. The district is also using ESSER funds to provide high-quality tutoring to students to accelerate their learning in the classrooms. These funds were also used to purchase software, secure curriculum, and hire tutors. Even our school communities that were significantly impacted by the pandemic are making investments to mitigate its effects. Tennessee's Memphis Shelby County Schools is using federal funding to provide technology and tutoring sessions to children before, during, and after school. Funds are being used to hire specialized education assistants in the classroom and to support teachers and help students re-engage. In New York City, the nation's largest public school district is using federal pandemic relief funds to pay for a variety of academic supports, including expanding its pre-K program while buying devices and providing remote learning opportunities. The Miami-Dade County Public Schools, which was discussed in the previous session as well, is using ESSER funds to provide students with K-12 interventionists and tutors, expanding the after-school enrichment programs in reading and math, and hiring coaches for Tier 1 instruction in schools. In addition, Miami-Dade is extending their summer school programming. Early results from state and interim tests since NAEP was given in January through March of this year indicate that classroom tutoring and summer school strategies are starting to mitigate the effects of COVID-19 on student performance. Still, these efforts will take time and financial support beyond the one-time expiring investments of ESSER for our schools in the future. Rather than looking back at policies and places to blame, let's celebrate those who stood in the gap to support students during the global pandemic that upended all walks of life, and especially in our schools. The pandemic impacted the entire nation. Scouring the data now to try to evaluate the success or failure of individual systems during the pandemic is woefully misguided. By far, the best use of this information is to help us understand where our greatest investment should be made moving forward. Clearly, our students of color our students with learning differences, our second language learners in our traditionally marginalized communities had and continue to have the least access to high-speed internet services. Their communities were hit hardest by COVID-19, and they have the poorest access to high-quality health care. If it were not clear already, these results show that we must continue to make significant federal, state, and local investments in our students and our school communities. Now is not the time to hold back school funding for a rainy day. These results indicate that it's raining now. The pandemic has affected every state, every school district, and every student demographic. Now is the time to reinvest in our students' futures and for all of our students and the country as a whole. We must not shortchange this opportunity. Our students can recover. Our schools can recover. But as Martin Luther King Jr. once stated, we are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. We must lift up and celebrate the teachers and administrators who rise every day to support our nation's youth. Most people will have missed this point, but this is the 20-year anniversary of NAEP, the NAEP TUDA program, after its inaugural year in 2002. 20 years ago, the nation's largest urban school districts raised their hands and volunteered to have their districts receive NAEP scores. They volunteered to do that today. They said then, and they say now, that they are committed to improving academic outcomes for our students. And over the past 20 years, urban school districts have proven their capacity to significantly improve student achievement despite the changes of any individual testing cycle. Large city school districts are poised to lead the way as the nation rebounds from the academic impact of the global pandemic. In June of last year, the Council of Great City Schools published a report called Mirrors or Windows: How Well Do Large City Public Schools Overcome the Effects of Poverty and Other Barriers? The report details the fact that academic achievement and improvement was significantly greater in large city school districts compared to the rest of the nation between 2003 and 2019. We called it educational torque. We improved faster than the nation in reading and made fourth in reading and math, 4th and 8th grades, and we studied what it took to make those gains. Our great city schools made up lost grounds before, and we'll do it again. With a continued focus on addressing unfinished learning through high-quality classroom instruction and just-in-time support, districts can ensure that all students remain on track to graduate college and career ready. And despite the immense challenges that urban schools face through the COVID-19 pandemic, the nation's large urban schools are determined and committed to improving the achievement of all of our students. And I believe that the skill and hard work of our teachers, our staff, our parents, and our communities over the next several years will recreate that trajectory of improvement across big cities seen before the pandemic. We still have more work to do, but I'm proud of the work that our cities have done over the past 3 years, and I'm profoundly optimistic about the progress and recovery that I know lies in front of us. Thank you for having us, and I look forward to taking any of your questions if you have them. Does anyone have any questions for me before I turn things back over to Dr. Matthews? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hart, for those compelling and contextualizing remarks. I think one of the interesting things, of course, about our large school districts is that they are large. And so there is a variety of nuance, a variety of strategy, because there are so many different kinds of students. And as you so eloquently stated, folks raised their hand to have the microscope pointed in that direction so that we could get into strategies that support all of our students. I am now pleased to introduce the panel that is going to solve all of our problems and tell us exactly what to do with what is ahead of us. I think that what is important from the panel that we're about to hear is that these are folks who are in the work, who are not just helping us generate the data, but are thinking about how to use it and to apply it. And in all seriousness, I'm not looking for answers. I'm looking for ideas. I'm looking to understand what has been tried, what has not been tried, what is making folks curious, courageous, and generating more questions. And for this, I will turn it over to Denise Forte. She is the interim CEO of the Education Trust, and she is going to moderate our panel this afternoon. Thank you, Denise.
Thank you, Dr. Matthews. I'm so excited to be here with all of you all today, including our friends that are listening to this or watching this via the streaming. I'm also really excited because I'm sharing the stage with some very, very big experts on these issues. And so I'm just as excited as you all to hear about what they have to say today. We're going to deepen our understanding and hopefully surface some real action items for all of us. And then at the end, I'm going to open it up for questions and also hope to hear some questions from folks that have been streaming this. And I really want to appreciate you up front for asking those questions. So let's get started. The first thing I want to do is have everybody introduce themselves. So I'm going to start with Roberto, and then we'll go. Well, actually, let me start with Tom, and then we'll just go down this way.
So I'm Tom Kane. I'm faculty director of the Center for Education Policy Research at Harvard.
Hi, Carrie Wright, former state superintendent from Mississippi.
Good afternoon. I'm Roberto Rodriguez, Assistant Secretary for Policy and Planning at the U.S. Department of Education.
Hello, Alberto Carvalho, Superintendent of LA USD, formerly of Miami-Dade for 15 years.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Gadara. I'm the Secretary of Education for the Commonwealth of Virginia.
And I'm Scott Marion. I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Assessment.
So these are some big hitters, folks. So I'm really excited about this conversation. So let's just start with the first one. My initial question is really just one of reaction. We have seen so much data today, and for the last few months, we've also seen data coming from states and districts. So given all of that, what do we take away from these NAEP results? I'm going to start with our state experts first. So Amy and Carrie, how do you look at these data? And how do you interpret these NAEP results based on your state's own data? And then I'd love to get Scott into that question as well, to consider these data across multiple states.
Sure, I'll go. So I can't speak to other states, although I've been learning a lot listening to this morning, but I can speak to Virginia. We have been diving into this data since having it last week. And the words we're using are, this is heart-wrenching, this is catastrophic, this is completely game-changing, and we are on the cusp of losing an entire generation of children. And we are taking it very seriously. And I guess the one thing I want to just highlight after taking part in this session today is that in Virginia, and again, I can't speak to others, this COVID is not the reason why we experienced the unbelievably dramatic drops. And let me just say them again, and they give me chills every time I say them out loud. Virginia had the largest drops of any state in the nation on both fourth grade math and fourth grade reading, tied with Maryland for fourth grade math. 3 times the average drop in both those pieces. And that is horrific. Something really bad is happening to have that happen, and something different in Virginia. And what we know is that COVID exacerbated and illuminated the fact that those losses were happening, but they started to happen before the word COVID was even in our language. When we go back and look at the data, we see dramatic drops starting in 2017. So this may be in other places as well, but in Virginia, we we are using this NAEP data as a flashlight, not as a hammer, to use a term I used to use a whole lot in my former life, to remind people that what can we learn about what happened before the pandemic happened, and then it became worse during the pandemic, obviously, but this dramatic drop in this. And I'll just very quickly say, we know in Virginia that we took our eyes off of the ball. We know that prior administrations weakened our transparency, they weakened our accountability systems, and lowered expectations. And we know from times 20 years ago that when Virginia and so many other states chose to go the other direction and to raise expectations and strengthen accountability and strengthen transparency, that our system and our schools and our teachers and our students performed and met those high expectations. Unfortunately, we now have evidence of Virginia that when we lower those expectations, we weaken the transparency, we weaken accountability, it's also possible to go in the wrong direction. I'm happy to talk more about what we're going to do with that, but this is an unbelievably somber day in Virginia.
Thank you, Amy. Carrie?
Yeah, I want to just pick up where Amy left off and have a few things to say. This is not a time to lower expectations for children. This is not a time to lower expectations for teachers and leaders. This is a time to keep expectations very high. I'm a firm believer that children will do and can do what you tell them they will do and can do, and provide the support to get them there. So this is not a time to water anything down. This is alarming. Our nation should be, all eyes should be on this in every single state. I can tell you that the first thing that I did was to take a look at our data compared to our statewide data, because I think that's what states should be looking at as well. Does your NAEP data mirror what you're seeing on your statewide assessments? And if not, why not? And if it does, then that's a signal that they're probably, they're probably compatible. For example, Mississippi held its own in reading compared to what it could have happened. And I honestly could attribute that to the fact that we have had a very strong foundation in the science of reading K-3, and that has not stopped. It also, when we look at what happened with us with NAEP, it also, our math drops also mirror our math drops that we also see nationally. So I think that's a part that I think is really, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, but I think it's very important to keep in line with the fact that NAEP gives you a global picture, but your statewide assessment is really where you have to drill down to individual children, and we'll talk about that as well.
And Scott, what's your takeaway from multiple states?
So we work in about 40 different states, and we've deeply analyzed data from about 20 of them, starting from 2021. We focus more on the state data. Tom's shop has been doing a lot with the interim assessment data. And if you would have asked me to predict ahead of time which states would have fared worse or better, I don't think I would have done that well. Right, on NAEP, except from seeing some of the state data. Because like Kerry said, in many cases it's coherent, but in many cases it's not quite as coherent as we would like, depending on where states. And there's some funny wonky stuff about where you set your cut scores related to the meat of your distribution of kids, that one little change could make a big difference one way or the other. But what we're urging people to do, and what I'm urging people is, I just want to say first, 8th grade math is scary as all get out, right? Because that's such a foundational set of content going into high school math. So that scares me to no end, and that's what I completely echo what Ray said. But what we're urging people to do is NAEP is only at the state level, which is great. It tells policymakers they need to pony up, like Ray said. But then for me to get into districts, schools, kids, I need state data, I need the interim data that Tom's working with to figure out what specific strategies, because it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all, and I'll stop.
Alberto, having led both Miami-Dade and now at the helm of LA, I'm sure that you have some insights here. And because LA is a story, what are you seeing in these results?
So I think actually one of the most powerful conclusions with the release of the NAEP data has little to do with education, and it has more to do with a high variability of protocols adopted by different states and districts that does not seem to have led to significantly different academic outcomes. So I hope that this is a precious moment in America where we say, no, we need to stop politicizing that and move on to teaching and learning, period. Because I came from Florida, a very different approach to COVID than California. But singling out Miami-Dade within those states and Los Angeles, Miami-Dade in Florida, Los Angeles in California, they are very, very bright stars in an otherwise very dark landscape of academic performance. So I think the most powerful thing is let's stop talking about those protocols. Let's stop talking about the politics of what was done, because it does appear, based on superficial examination of the data, that there were no easy conclusions tying one set of protocols and politics to academic performance. Look, I think in both districts, a number of things are true. Number one, these were districts that pivoted much faster and much more effectively towards a virtual learning environment with much powerful connectivity, attendance, connection, and engagement, one-to-one virtual resources already adopted, LMS systems in place or similar to LMS systems in place, allowing teachers, parents, students to achieve a higher level of engagement that was organized, it was coherent. Secondly, aggressive professional development leading the pandemic, throughout the pandemic, and exiting the pandemic. Effective utilization of federal funds, whether we're talking particularly of ESSER, combined with entitlement programs, Title I, II, III, et cetera, for the purpose of extension of the regular school day, expanded summer school programs targeting, not everybody, but targeting the students who, based on progress monitoring data, required the greatest level of intervention. Using the strategy as far as human resources that work, interventionists and coaches, push in, pull out. And then, of course, speaking for LA, the fact that the district made huge investments in terms of learning packs that were sent home with every single kid. We did not hide. Same thing is true for Miami. If you look at those two districts, very different parts of the country, both in the South, by the way, just different Souths, since there was such concern about the South, outperformed the nation, outperformed in terms of growth or performance, even large cities. The question now is, will my colleagues across the country actually look at this data and rather than simply wanting to do something different for the purpose of attempting a change, look at the data and use the data as a means of asking the question. My district is demographically similar to this district with remarkably parallel percentages of ELL, students with disabilities, black and brown kids, poverty levels, but with vastly different performance levels. So maybe I ought to make that call and ask, what's going on here in your fourth grade reading, math, eighth grade math, or eighth grade reading that is so vastly different from my district when our student populations are so similar? I think therein lies the golden opportunity for America. So let's look at the best practices that the data reveals, and let's stop politicizing education, for obviously the arguments up until now have been proven to be null.
Thank you for that, Alberto. And the thing that I'm going to take away from that is use the data. And so turning to Tom, I'd love to hear from you. You did an analysis a while back looking at some of the states. And how do you interpret that data against what we saw with NAEP this year?
So I'd encourage everybody to look at the magnitude of these losses relative to the effect sizes for the various interventions we have available. Because if you were to do that, you would find these results really startling. So for instance, the loss in Baltimore in eighth grade math is about the same size as the pre-pandemic research implied you would get with providing high dosage tutoring to everybody, not to 5% or 10% of kids. Like the magnitude of losses in some of these districts is quite large. And so rather than be thinking about incremental things, oh, we're going to do some tutoring, oh, we're going to do some summer school, none of which is designed to solve the problem. We should instead start with the magnitude of the losses in each district and in each state. Look at the evidence on the efficacy of things like high dosage tutoring, but also summer school, after school, double dose math, and et cetera. And put together a program of interventions which even on paper, is enough to close these gaps. I'm not aware, I haven't seen a single district's plan that if we were to multiply through, okay, what percentage of kids are getting tutors, what percentage of kids are going to summer school, that if you were to do that math, it would add up to the magnitude of the loss that we've seen. And so it's not about sort of having a few programs that are directionally correct but don't add up to the magnitude of the loss that students have suffered. And the sooner we do that, I think the better off students will be.
Thank you. You know, as I looked at the data, probably some of the more troubling points that were lifted up for me was how many of our Black students were doing, how our Latinx students were performing. In particular, when you're looking at some of the districts and states that have been underserving these communities for a very long time. I'm just sort of curious to hear from all of you, how concerned should we be about these results, especially for those groups that have faced systemic barriers in their communities? Scott and Tom, considering the other data that you've seen, Scott, I'll start with you. How concerned should we be?
I mean, extremely concerned. But I think we have to be extremely concerned for everyone, because everyone, we saw with 8th grade math, we saw with a lot of stuff, everyone lost ground. Now, there are kids who will be able to recapture that ground because of resources available to them faster. And so I think, Tom's colleague and our former governing board member, Andrew Ho, and I tease each other about, he likes to use months of learning. And I think the way Tom just characterized these losses in terms of effect size compared to our best science at improving learning is really humbling, because I agree. I don't think it's going to add up. I think we need to think about changing structures. So if we're going to keep trying to pour these interventions into broken structures, they won't last. They won't sustain. And so I think we have to think about, in certain cases, whether it's innovation zones or what it might be. And there are great leaders. We have two great leaders on the panel. I don't know you as well, I'm sorry, and you're new. But these guys have this history of building structures, building a structure of the science and reading in your state from pre-service through in-service, through all sorts of intensive curriculum support, the kind of work that Alberto's done in Miami of building these structures. You have to build structures to sustain these interventions. So we should be really frightened, and for all kids, obviously for the kids who have the least, in the bank already, they clearly the need is there.
Tom, what are you seeing in the States?
So NAEP test results aren't just measuring test-taking skills, and they're not just measuring irrelevant academic knowledge. They are leading indicators of the future well-being of our students. And how do we know that? Well, if you look historically, there are a number of states that have seen large increases in NAEP over time. So for instance, North Carolina, a lot of people don't realize this, North Carolina, between 1990 and around 2010, had seen a full 1 standard deviation improvement in achievement. You might say, like, what's a standard deviation? Well, that's the increase in North Carolina since 1990 is larger than the black-white achievement gap was in 1990. A whole state moved by that amount over the last 3 decades. But not every state saw increases that large. There were some others that also saw increases, not quite that large. And so what we did was we said, okay, within the states that saw large and small increases, let's compare what happened to the incomes and educational attainment and arrest rates and incarceration rates for the more recent cohorts compared to the older birth cohorts. And do we see any evidence of benefit? Actually, there were substantial increases in improvements in outcomes in the states that had the largest increase on NAEP in the past. So if these 8th grade MAP scores or 8th grade NAEP scores if this loss were to become permanent, if there were like an 8-point decline, for students, that would represent about a 1.6% decline in incomes later in life. And you might say, gosh, like what's 1.6%? Well, added up across 48 million kids enrolled in K-12 education, it's almost $1 trillion. That's what it is. And so unless we figure out ways to close these gaps, and fortunately, we haven't talked about it yet, but fortunately, school districts have a lot of resources right now from the federal government to help with this catch up. So unless we use that money to effectively catch up over the next couple of years, there will be dramatic consequences for students.
Okay, that number was really, really big. And when you think of your school district of Proto, that could have a serious impact on the well-being of learners for quite some time. But given what you saw in your district, which has a high proportion of minority students.
So whether we're talking about, again, Los Angeles, and for a little bit of time, forgive me, but I feel that I'm still operating 2 time zones where the realities are remarkably similar. I'm going to continue to reemphasize that, because we ought to stop looking at the country, north, south, east, west, just look at the best practices wherever they may be and establish the parallels specific to demographic representation. So whether you're talking about Los Angeles currently or Miami-Dade, the overrepresentation of black and brown kids, English language learners, and the higher than national average representation of students with disabilities, it merits a deeper analysis. Whether we look specific to LA back to 2003 or just 2019, we actually see black students, for example, performing better this time around in 2019 and significantly better, consistent with the rest of the large cities over the past 2 decades. By the way, that's not something that you often read in the headlines. You read in the headlines that large cities in America are broken, nothing is happening there. But guess what? The rate of gap closure over the past 2 decades has been studied and restudied, and it is real. It is true. It is true. So there are bright spots. And I think what has worked is exactly the theory of action of building structures, of standardizing progress monitoring tools, of providing before and after school extended learning programs, of adding arts, music, and foreign language to these schools to bring relevance and connection, not just a double dosing in mathematics. There is research. If that's all you do, yes, you'll get short-term bumps, but you get stagnation beyond that. And then, of course, it's doing something that we often don't do. We're doing in Los Angeles, we did it in Miami, and that helped us entering the pandemic. Parent academies, family academies, teach the parents how to best support their students at home, provide an echo of learning in the home, and why not? Now that across the country we are more connected than ever before, the student portal can become a parent portal with aggressive coursework that addresses the needs our students are feeling, empower the parent on early identification, engagement, and support for the kids. So again, Los Angeles is an extreme outlier this time around. And I like what you said. I mean, NAEP, one of the most powerful things about NAEP is it gives you a lens into the future. So considering where LA is, despite the circumstances and the difficulties, we're very, very encouraged and very optimistic, notwithstanding the very dark clouds of performance that we've seen across the country. I think that's the power of NAEP.
You translate some of this data for teachers and families, for educators and families?
Well, I think families are really going to be depending a lot on teachers and leaders to do just that. I've often said, parents entrust us with their most prized possessions. Somebody once said that and then said they don't keep the good kids at home. And that is so true. These little ones come to school every single day, and I use little ones meaning K-12. They come to school every single day, and parents are depending on us to do that. And so my advice, even to my team and to the state, is, behind every data point is a face. And if you don't know who that face is, you're missing the boat. Because there is not a one-size-fits-all for African-American children. There's not a one-size-fits-all for students with disabilities. You've got to drill down to that individual child. And that's where your state data and district data really can come to fro. Because that's when teachers and leaders need to be gathering around tables right now, data charts out in front of them, identifying children that are in need of service, because these 8th graders that did so miserably are now in high school. So our time is passing by, and we really need to be drilling down to individual children to see what's going on with them. And most importantly, following that, what help do our teachers need? I mean, our professional development and building the capacity of our teachers is huge, because I think every teacher comes into school every day wanting to do the very best that they can. Every single teacher. But just like all of us, some arrive at these jobs with gifts that others don't have. But that doesn't mean they can't learn those skill sets that they need in order to make sure that they're the best that they could be in front of that classroom. So parents are going to be looking to us. I think parents need to be invited in. I think too often they are not. They need to be invited in, the data shared with parents, and enlist them as a partner. Alberto was talking about the family academies, teaching parents how to be the best advocates, because their children, that's a huge responsibility. When I think about when I let my 2 girls walk into that classroom, that was huge for me as a mom. Like, I'm giving you the people I love more than anything in this whole world, and entrusting you to build their life accordingly. Well, that hasn't changed over time. And so I think parents need to be seen as partners. They need to know the data. They need to know specifically what schools are going to be doing, not just we're going to be working with Carrie in math or we're going to be working with Carrie in reading. No, that's not enough. What does Carrie need in math and what does Carrie need in reading in order to become a better student?
Thank you so much for that. So we have heard a few bright spots, but I want to focus on that a little bit more in this next question. I'm sure the overall picture did not surprise anyone, and the overall takeaway has generally been about the declines in test scores. For me, I was particularly interested, and I really am looking forward to digging in a little bit more about our children with learning differences and our ELL, our second language learners students. I'm going to throw this out to anybody to talk about what some of the bright spots were for you, but I'd love to start with Roberto.
Well, I think, Denise, you mentioned, you had a great question here around, what are the implications for our learning gaps? What are the implications for our students that have been traditionally underserved? The implications for all of our students from this data are huge, right? I've been following this data for, over 20 years at the federal level as a policymaker. And the NAEP is such an important barometer of the direction we're going in as a country. We've never seen this magnitude of a drop, particularly in 8th grade mathematics. It is jarring, it is sobering, it is deeply disturbing, right? And we can look at some of this data. We'll look at our English learners data. I'd be very interested to hear from our other panelists around that. We know that some of our students that may not have been able to have been redesignated in our English learner subgroup might still be in this data. So perhaps that's part of what we're seeing in terms of some progress there. But the reality is we need to do much better, as a country, for all of our subgroups, all of our populations here that are contained in the NAEP. And I think, let's be clear, these results, I think, are a clarion call for us to double down on the instructional core. Right? What are we doing with respect to teaching, learning, supporting and scaffolding those skills and that knowledge for our teachers, engaging our parents as full partners in that data and in those strategies? We know that over half of our districts are engaged in high dosage tutoring and other tutoring to support their student learning, right? As part of this acceleration, we've invested $130 billion in ESSER, thanks to the support of Congress, to really help move that forward. But we have to take a look at what's working out there, the evidence base. We know what works here, right? We know that if we have individualized, tailored instruction, we have opportunities to utilize formative and diagnostic tools to help see where students are and help them move forward. Look at that data in an effective manner, in a systemic manner, improve the skills and knowledge and supports for our teachers, our instructional personnel. We know that we can turn the tide here, but we have to be able to do that at scale. That is the charge, and I think that's a charge for our students with disabilities and for our English learners, just as it is with all of our students.
Thank you. I think scale is very important in this conversation. Scott, what about the bright spots for you?
I'm usually an optimist, but I'm having trouble with bright spots, and just because it's not like 2019 was a great year, right? We have still such a long way to go in terms. Tom mentioned the achievement gaps earlier, right? And your organization is designed to advocate for doing something about that. So and the other thing I just want to say why I'm not just jumping at bright spots is I've been writing a lot the last couple of weeks about not sort of chasing just so stories, right? Like I see some data, let me make up a story to explain it. In the best of intentions, right? Because we do that. We naturally do that. So the advantage we have with this NAEP is the link to get into the data, to the school pulse survey and other forms of data to allow us to really try to unpack this and learn where there were some good things happening and try to explain it, but go in with some hypotheses. I know I'm not sounding that fun, but to think about some hypotheses ahead and then test them with the data as opposed to looking at the data and trying to find where things are. This is complex, and we always joke in our field that if you have one watch, you always know what time it is. If you have two, you're never quite sure. That was a better joke before iPhones, but it was. But the reality is, we have a lot of watches right now, and it's to try to figure out, but we do have this rich data source that we're just all starting to dig into. So I think we'll find bright spots, but I think we have to look at them in a disciplined way and look for them and to really, instead of just sort of latching on to something that looks good.
Anyone else want to jump in on the bright spots? Yeah, Tom.
Well, I'm not sure I'd describe it as a bright spot as much as like a glaring inconsistency. And that is, if you pair these results that we've been talking about today with parent surveys, 90% or more of parents seem to think their child is currently on grade level, despite the pandemic. Now, partially, I'm not blaming parents. Partially, I think that's based on the information that they have available to them. When you think about it, like what's the main thing parents see? They see whether their kid is happy going off to school, if their kid is happy coming back from school, and what their grades are. What we're seeing today is that, okay, all that may be fine or is getting back to normal, but kids are not covering the material that they're supposed to be covering in their current grade. And it's up to school leaders, starting with teachers, but also to superintendents, to state commissioners, need to be honest with parents about where we are. Because if they're not, and actually I think there are a lot of commissioners and superintendents who have not been honest, who are focusing more on, okay, what's the bounce back since 2021, when you realize, wait a minute, the pandemic didn't start in 2021. We should be comparing where we are relative to 2019, and there are a lot of districts who are way behind where they were in 2019. And here's why that's so critical, to be honest with parents about where kids are in terms of the content for their grade. And that is, it's going to be really hard to ask for the hard things that we're going to need to do if parents seem to think everything's fine. So, for instance, if I know Superintendent Carvalho was seeking extending the school year this year. I actually have a hard time seeing some districts, not necessarily LAUSD, but some of the districts with much larger losses in the data. I have a hard time seeing an increase, seeing them bounce back enough without doing things like extending the school year or using school vacation academies. And yet, if parents think everything's fine, it's going to be almost impossible to ask for that kind of change. And so I would just call on all of our leaders to be much more honest with parents about where things stand now in terms of kids being up to date with their current grade standards. And if we do that, we can start to build much more of a sense of ownership and on this recovery effort that we need to get going in the next couple of years.
Can we extend the honesty to state legislatures too?
Yes. Amen.
Can I just say one thing? You know, this, and this, I know preaching to the choir, but this is hard work. This is not a simple fix. This is not going back and doing the same thing we've done over and over and over again and expecting a different outcome. This is really re-examining what we're doing inside the school day. You know, how much time is really being spent teaching? How much time is being spent on reading? How much time is being spent on mathematics? How much time is being spent providing the professional development that our teachers need in order to utilize that time well? This is, if any of us up here could be multimillionaires if we had the silver bullet, right? But there is no silver bullet to students learning. It is hard work, it is day in and it is day out, and it is sticking to it regardless of how hard it gets. And it is making sure, and that's what our teachers do every single day, and our leaders do every single day. But we've also got to make students wanting to come to our classrooms, wanting them to feel like they're welcome, wanting them to feel that they're included. But this part of it, this is the beginning of a large journey, but I don't want people to walk away thinking that this is going to be done in a matter of time. This is over the long haul.
Absolutely. You are preaching to the choir, but I've been saying for a long time now that this pandemic was not 1 or 2 years. It's going to be long-lasting. Alberto?
She actually just made one of my points. I mean, my near obsession with shining a light on, jurisdictions where something unnatural happened is twofold. Number one is because if you're holding the torch, be proud. Secondly, I think this year's release of NAEP data speaks to resiliency. You just said it. It's hard work. There are no silver bullets. And teachers and principals and support staff made it happen. So why? Why is it in certain communities we saw an aggressive bucking of the trend? And with that said, what was stated previously is absolutely right. Let's go before 2019. There was nothing really great happening. Yes, you still had pretty much the same outliers in terms of performance, but woefully low percentage of students performing above basic. And that's where we need to actually pay closer attention to. Yes, these bumps in certain districts are important, but I don't think that both realities are mutually exclusive. I celebrate LA, I celebrate Miami, but I also recognize that the percentage of students who are not making it in these two same districts is unacceptable. With that said, something is happening there, and kudos to our teachers that despite the challenges, despite the accusations, I mean, they came in as heroes, and then people sort of turned on them and called them zeros because of nothing more, nothing less than adopted policies in different parts of the country. No, they are heroes, as are the custodial staff and all the folks who made this happen. But I think maintaining that dual reality of truth. There are hot spots, there are bright spots in the country that we ought to look for the best practices. What are the organized structures and systems that were put into place? How well are these parent academies working? What is your professional development like? How are you really leveraging the power of connectivity and digital content? Are you striking it aggressively in terms of identifying the students who really need the high dosage tutoring? I was not happy when I first arrived in LA. 10% of those kids were getting services. We boosted it to 20% in just a matter of months. Something is working. So, but the two realities are not mutually exclusive. You can celebrate bright spots across the country for the sake of identification of best practices that can be replicated and amplified, while at the same time not losing track of the fact that an exceedingly high percentage of students are not even performing at basic level in NAEP, no matter what your growth or what your static performance is.
So Amy, I know you wanted to get it.
Thank you. So I'd like to build on several of the comments that have been made the last two rounds. One is there isn't any silver bullet in education, but we cannot get out of this hole that we're in right now without using information in a different way. And I just want to make 2 points on this. One is, to what Tom was saying, we have a huge issue in Virginia that we have been telling not only parents, but taxpayers, teachers, everyone, that everything is okay. I mentioned before our accreditation system, which is really another name for an accountability system that's non-existent. And we just announced that 89% of our schools are fully accredited, and we have no schools in Virginia that are not accredited. So just pause for a second and remember the data that you saw in Virginia, and you tell me how much honesty that we are providing to the people of Virginia. To a normal person, you say 89% of our schools are accredited and all of our schools are accredited. You think everything's hunky-dory, like I'm gonna go move to Virginia. And it's not. And so part of this is about how do we use information and data, and this is why I am the greatest cheerleader for NAEP, is because this use of data as a flashlight to focus on what's working, what's not working, where we need to prioritize our resources and our energy and our time and our money, is because we do that. And in places where you put that light under a basket, like in Virginia, where we have not used data in a way to empower people, to inform people, and to improve, guess what? We've got lousy results. And so one of the things I am most excited about, and my bright spot, I hope, using the light analogy, is that this somber, terrible day for Virginia, will actually be a wake-up call that people realize we need to look at what's going on and we need to change what we're doing and use data to do that. And one of the things I am most excited about that the governor, we started today with an event in Richmond at 8 o'clock, and one of the things that the governor redoubled down on is something that we launched over the summer, because we knew this was going to be our data. We're not surprised at all about this, because we had data that had never been shared before with Virginians that said 42% of our second graders are not on track to read independently by third grade. That's a death knell. We knew from our state scores that we released in May that we had really terrible declines. We knew our ACT scores, so the data kept coming, so we weren't surprised at all. We were shocked at how bad it was, but it was not bad. So we've been thinking about this since day one in office, and one of the things that we rolled out this summer is called the Bridging the Gap Initiative. And the thing I think is transformative is we are making a commitment, and today we announced that we're going to expedite this, to provide every student, every parent, and every teacher a snapshot of all of the data points we have collected on them, on students at the local and state level, and provide basically a story of where is this child, where is this youth at this moment. And for any and every student, and the key there is to what several of the panelists said is, how do you then change that conversation? Right now, the number one thing we hear from teachers is they don't have access to information in a manageable way, in an actionable way that they know what to do with it. And if anyone hasn't looked at the Learning Heroes research that Tom referenced, please go look at it. This is a moment to double down on this, right? This story about parents thinking everything's okay, teachers knowing it's not, no one's having the conversation. We're trying to change that in Virginia by providing the 3 critical pieces. I taught in Japan for a year. Number one thing I learned, Japanese education thinks about education as being balanced on a 3-legged stool. You need the parent, the student, and the teacher working together. And if one of those legs is wobbly, the other 2 need to compensate and work together in partnership. That's the moment that Carrie's talking about. How do we change this conversation and use information and see every child, and then say, how are we going to make sure that we are meeting every child where he or she is and getting them where they need to go? The only way you can do that is if you have everyone's looking at the same data points and then saying, so what does this tell us? Now, what are we going to do differently, and how are we going to do this together? And so what we're doing is providing this data set, this picture of what's going on. And for every student who is not on track for success, and it turns out in Virginia, that's going to be a lot of them, we are also going to create a personalized learning plan that the teacher, the student, and the parent will work together so it's a constructive conversation. And we're going to provide training for our educators to know how to have the hard conversations with both students and their parents about how do we do this in a constructive instructive way so that we remember what we're focusing on is getting every child to be on track for success in life. So again, to me, this is about how do we change the role of information, and we need data at all data points. This NAEP data is so important for shining a light and waking us up to what's not working, but that we need that longitudinal data, that student level information that can really allow us to pinpoint and make changes in individual children's lives. So that's the bright point. I hope today marks a whole culture change in how we use information.
That's a powerful way to help us almost close out this session. We only have a couple minutes left. And I'm going to start with Roberto because he wanted to get in on the last question. But before we open it up to the floor and also our folks who are streaming in right now, if we were to reconvene next year, what would we want to see happen? What would be the thing we'd want to talk about both then and into the future? And I'll start with Roberto.
Well, I would love to see us as a country marshal the time, the attention, and the resources in a more focused way on the academic progress that we need to see for all of our students. Right? That is our charge here. It is absolutely using the data and getting to an even deeper level of data that's useful at the classroom level and for our teachers. That's certainly true. But let's remember that we have an evidence base around what works here. Like, we know how to improve the instructional core. It is hard work, right, as has been said. We know we need partners alongside our teachers and our students in making sure that they can get the progress made. But we know what works in engaging parents. Right, but we have to focus our policies and our systems more intentionally on that evidence base. So I would love to see that level of focus. And that doesn't mean that the federal government has to prescribe a one-size-fits-all approach to get there. It does mean we have a role to play around aggregating and supporting that evidence base. And this is why we've been focused on this from day one, in providing handbooks for our field to help support this. We're going to be kicking off another series focused on academic recovery on Wednesday to really bring together some of that expertise and provide that opportunity for the entire country to learn from that. But that is the effort that we need in the moment that we're in. And we have, what brings me optimism, the stories and the examples that we are seeing, the living proof, the testaments of that hard work in play in districts and states around the country. NAEP is an important snapshot. And then as you travel around the country, we are seeing tremendous examples of putting into practice that evidence base and students catching up and students accelerating. That should give us all optimism and hope. The other thing that should give us optimism and hope is that we have resources in the system in a way we never have before to get this work done. There's $130 billion in ESSER dollars that are available today. We worked expeditiously with states to get those dollars out. Our districts have shaped plans around those dollars. We know that $27 billion, at least $27 billion of those dollars from independent sources have said that that's going to be focused on academic recovery. My question today is that enough? Can we ask every district to go back and look at their budgets and their time and their policies and their attention on this challenge and say, what more do we need to do with the resources that we have now to really accelerate our progress, to up our game on behalf of our students over the next couple of years?
Thank you, Roberto. I'm going to turn to the audience for questions. Our in-person audience. Okay, over here.
Paulo Di Maria from the National Association of State Boards of Education. Great panel. Dr. Carvalho, I love what you say about best practices, and I think they're academic best practices, but also change management best practices. I think, to the gentleman's point, we know what different looks like, but we have a hard time actually making change. You have done a pretty good job, a very good job, of effectuating change. What are some of your secrets in terms of approaching the adults in the system to drive changes in adult behavior that ultimately lead to changes in classroom behavior to make the kind of differences that we're seeing today?
Yeah, I think we actually as a country know exactly what it takes to teach kids how to read, compute, write. It's no longer a skill set deficit, it's a will set proposition. It's a lack of political courage to do that which is proven to be right, and it always works. But often adult circumstances, pronouncements, politics get in the way of us doing the right thing for kids. What I think has worked is fairly simple. There are 5 things that I've identified. Number one, having structures and systems that provide homogeneous understanding of what the data reveals and the best practices that it informs. That homogeneous, standardized, whether it's progress monitoring tools, periodic assessments, can then use to provide differentiated support and funding. I don't believe in funding every single kid at the same level, and the districts that I've led, we differentiate significantly, funding on a basis of circumstance, on a basis of performance and needed assistance. Professional development, that is also tied to that differentiated data profile. Earned autonomy models for schools, meaning, you get independent control of your finances and even curricular decisions to the extent the performance reveals that you're in full control producing results that make sense. Otherwise, you get much more directed support and accountability. Establishing systems within systems. So whether it was Miami, ETO, Educational Transformation Office, or LA, Data Dig, the 100 most fragile schools with the most fragile populations. I know if I move that 10% of students, 10% of schools, the system will jump. Make those schools accountable to me, which they are. If they succeed, I succeed. If they don't succeed, I should not deserve to stay in my job. Leverage the power of parents through data, parent academies, family academies. Elevate the best-in-class teachers, don't take them out of the classroom, pay them more, incentivize them more to be in-school coaches and interventionists. Don't create pathways where a teacher to earn more money leaves the classroom. Do the same thing for assistant principals and principals. Leverage lattice leadership opportunities to keep the best in class in the classroom or in the school. And then the last one comes right out of Lincoln. Paint the picture, tell a story. We are lousy as educators in terms of painting the picture and telling the story about what works.
Wonderful. Can I get a question from the streaming audience?
Yes. Thank you for asking. I have here from Gabriela Burma from Beyond Basics. Systemic change takes time. How can we ensure high school students who have less time to catch up receive the diagnostic-driven, individualized daily literacy intervention they need now so that they graduate with skills and confidence, able to pursue every college and career opportunity?
Either Carrie or Amy want to take that question? Sorry.
Apologize. I have the world's worst cold. I'm just coming off of it. One thing that I think high schools could do, and I know some of our high schools in Mississippi have done this, they've totally re-examined the high school day, and in order to make the most of the day. It's not just a 4x4, 7-period day, 8-period day, whatever it is. They've literally looked at every minute of the day, at every person of the day, in order to build in extra time for students who need the help the most inside that student day, so they're not being penalized by having to come after school and not being able to participate in sports. So it happens during the day. But that took a whole high school coming together and all agreeing that there were children in the school that needed more help than they were getting beyond the regular day. So they still have their same periods, but on those times that they are creating those intervention periods, these high schools have done it so they've been so successful, particularly in this one district, that the middle schools now want to take a look at re-examining their schedules. So that's what I'm saying about we have to look at things to be done differently. You can't just keep the same thing and expect the same, a different kind of an outcome. And that took a lot of courage for high schools. For those of you that know our high school friends, they're pretty good about that regimen around that schedule. But it took a lot of courage for those high schools to do that. And now those individual children are getting the help that they need inside the school day.
And I'll just add quickly onto that, with a shout out to Carrie and the leadership that she showed around literacy across the nation, and another shout out to the value of NAEP, right? The world was watching what Mississippi did because they looked at their NAEP scores and said something awesome is happening there. That's what we did in Virginia. We knew we had a crisis in literacy, and so we passed our bipartisan Virginia Literacy Act based on what Mississippi did, and we're hoping someone then comes on top and builds it on top of ours. But the bottom line is it's a yes and answer to the question from online. We need to focus on what we're doing with literacy is we're putting $70 million into retraining teachers to doing interventions with students of all ages challenges, prioritizing how we change our schools of education, soup to nuts, including how do we catch up students in high school and focus on the science of reading as a focus of helping students at all levels. But it's a yes and. It's also, we can't just keep doing things the way we do it in education. So one of the things that Governor Youngkin has launched in his piece is this lab school approach, which is basically about bringing innovation and choice throughout the Commonwealth and changing how we provide multiple pathways, that not a one-size-fits-all to education, but thinking about how do we meet students where they are, how do we break down the walls between schools and the world beyond them, especially with employers, and we think that that will get much better results in addressing skills as well, and skill development when we're bringing people with students into the community and the community into schools as well.
This has been such an interesting conversation for me. I'm so appreciative of everybody on stage. I'm appreciative of those out in the audience and those out in the streaming world. And if one thing that's the big takeaway is, let's not be afraid of the data. This data is really showing us something very serious, and it is a clarion call. And I'd love to have Dr. Matthews come up back on stage to join us.
A well-deserved round of applause for our moderator and all of our panelists. Thank you all for joining us today for NAEP Day 2022, and keeping in mind that NAEP Day is a metaphor. Let every day be a NAEP Day where you're looking at data. Please explore the full 2022 NAEP math and reading results at nationsreportcard.gov. A recording of this panel, of the entire day, will be posted at nagb.gov as well. And then it says, insert parting words of hope and promise here. And so for that, I would say that as we pull all of this together, I invite us all into a space of what I call the art of constructive wrangling. The National Assessment Governing Board and the National Center for Education Statistics work through this every day. There's always wrangling. There's always push and pull. There's always the kind of tension that comes with authenticity when it comes to addressing what is happening in our education systems. And I would encourage us to resist the temptation of lowering the bar. Instead of lowering the bar, we could take this moment to believe in higher horizons. Resist the urge to point fingers. Instead, we can pick levers. We can look at our neighbors and see what is being done and learn to use from that. And above all, do not guess. Ask good questions and use good data. Interrogate good data. Adopt practices informed by good data so that you can generate more good data, rinse and repeat. As we honor the whole child, as we come into this space of thinking about the whole child and the whole educator, this is an opportunity for us to acknowledge that we are a whole nation. And the results show what many of us have always known, that the choice before us is about all or none. $1 trillion impact predicted by these scores is GDP changing impact. This is all or none. This is not a zero-sum game. This is not a time for scarcity mindsets. This is not a time to fear authenticity or asking for what we actually need. It is an opportunity to acknowledge that we can choose all. That is the choice that I will make, and I encourage us all to do the same. Please have a wonderful day.